Hi guys. Tonight we begin with the faint glow of torches in a stone corridor, their waxy smoke curling into air already thick with the perfume of medieval chambers. You slip quietly past the tapestries and push through a carved wooden door, and the scent rushes at you: rose oil, crushed amber, and musk so heavy you wonder if the air itself has turned to velvet. The strangest part is how intentional it all feels. Every whiff is part of a system, a ritual, a way of telling the body what it should feel. And you, drifting through this palace, realize you are about to step into the most intimate and bizarre world of medieval princesses. You probably won't survive this time-traveled whiplash without raising an eyebrow. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, and your journey begins. The chambers are perfumed, but not for your pleasure, at least not directly. Your mind drifts to a fact the records confirm. Inventories of noble households list barrels of rosewater and jars of civet musk as carefully as they record grain or wine. For princesses, especially those raised in cloisters before marriage, their first encounters with intimacy were staged in air thick with concoctions, thought to align the body with desire. To us, it smells like too much incense at a gift shop. To them, it smelled like destiny. Oddly enough, some recipes for chamber perfume involved ingredients you'd rather not place anywhere near your pillow. Ground stag musk mixed with whale ambergris, for example, produced a scent so powerful that even centuries-old clothing in museums still faintly carries it. Imagine being expected to drift to sleep every night in that heady fog, with no escape but a drafty window. There is no agreement among scholars on whether these fragrances were genuinely believed to spark lust, or if they were more about hiding the far less glamorous odors of medieval plumbing and crowded castles. One group argues the perfumes were aphrodisiacs. Another insists they were a cover-up, a polite deception for royal noses. And perhaps both were true, because when you cannot control who you marry, at least you can control what the room smells like when duty calls. For a moment, it feels as though the scent itself has fingers. It clings to the brocade curtains, it trails down the silk sheets, it rests on the skin of the princess herself, shaping how others perceive her before she even speaks. The medieval mindset wrapped perfume into morality. A sweet fragrance meant a pure soul, while a sour odor suggested corruption. Imagine the pressure. If you happen to smell a little too strongly of onions, the court might assume you've been sinning. One scandalous aside comes from a French chronicle that whispers of a young princess who doused herself so heavily in civet oil that visiting nobles fainted during a banquet. Whether that's true or just court satire, the image lingers. A woman so powerful in scent alone that men keeled over like actors in a farce. It makes you smile, and maybe cough a little, just imagining it. Your ears catch the shuffle of servants. Behind the scenes, chambermaids were responsible for maintaining the perfumed world, sprinkling herbs into fires, boiling lavender water, smearing balms on wooden floors. They inhaled the same fog but without the privilege of meaning. For them, it was labor, not luxury. And you can almost feel the texture of the task. The sticky residue of resin on fingertips, the rough sting of sage smoke in the eyes. A council decree proves how political these smells could become. In certain Italian courts, rules dictated which herbs were allowed in bridal chambers, insisting on rosemary for fertility and banning too much myrrh for fear it might weaken conception. What enters your nose, in this strange logic, enters your womb, your destiny, your kingdom's succession, all from a bundle of herbs. Historians bicker over the role of church authorities in these matters. Some argue priests encouraged perfume chambers as symbolic of divine fragrance, God's presence cloaked in flowers. Others see the clergy frowning on it as excess, another decadent habit of the ruling elite. When you picture bishops wrinkling their noses at civet musk, it feels oddly relatable. Too much perfume has been a universal complaint across centuries. The air grows warmer as more candles are lit, their beeswax adding a honeyed undertone to the floral cloud. You notice how it clings to fabric, how every gesture, lifting a goblet, adjusting a sleeve, becomes a small release of scent. The princess herself is caught inside this invisible performance. Even when she is tired, even when she is frightened, her room announces her body before she utters a word. Imagine being a young woman told that fragrance is your armor, your responsibility, your fate. You stand at the threshold of marriage, and the perfumed chamber is less a sanctuary than a stage. A curious footnote lingers from a Spanish court. Some princesses carried tiny pomanders, metal orbs filled with perfumed herbs that they clutched like rosaries during solemn processions. Public, sacred, yet tinged with a private message. My scent is my signal. Was it about holiness, or about reminding everyone of feminine power laced in fragrance? Scholars can't agree, and maybe you don't need them to. The power of smell is too immediate to require theory. For a moment, the echo of medieval life feels close. The scratch of quills noting perfume expenses, the laughter of courtiers when a scent experiment goes wrong, the sigh of a princess breathing deeply before stepping into a marriage bed scented more like a spice market than a home. You almost cough again, but then you relax into the haze. And just as you start to settle, you realize this was only the beginning. Tonight, you're not just floating through perfume. You're about to wander into codes stitched into silk, into secrets whispered in embroidery and fabric. The perfumed chamber fades, but the strangeness of desire continues to linger, ready to weave into the very threads of clothing. The scent still clings to your imagination as you drift onward, but now the chamber air gives way to cloth yards of silk, satin, and embroidered linen. Your fingertips brush against smooth threads, cool and almost slippery, until you pause at one detail that catches the dim torchlight, a tiny stitched motif at the hem of a princess's gown. At first it looks like an innocent flower. Then you realize it is not simply floral. The petals are too suggestive, the shapes too deliberate. These are silken codes, patterns meant to whisper what lips could never say aloud. Records confirm that noble wardrobes were not just wardrobes. They were archives of identity, status, and at times coded intimacy. Embroidery was expensive, requiring hours of needlework by women who often knew far more than they were allowed to express. And in the thread, some of them stitched symbols that carried double meanings. A swan might mean chastity at court banquets, yet in private it hinted at sensual longing, its arched neck a visual pun. Oddly enough, certain embroidery manuals from the 15th century contain drawings of knots and twists that later scholars recognized as fertility charms. Were they placed on royal undergarments? Perhaps. A curious footnote in an Italian dowry inventory lists 3 chemises adorned with protective knots, a phrase that seems innocent until you picture what those knots might have meant for the wedding night. Scholars bicker over how intentional these codes were. Some argue princesses themselves chose the motifs, nudging seamstresses to hide their feelings in thread. Others insist it was gossip after the fact, courtiers reading scandal into what might have been just pretty patterns. Arguments split along the lines of who you think had more agency: the young woman with little political power but sharp eyes, or the court chronicler with too much imagination. Your ears catch the faint squeak of scissors, the snip of thread, the whisper of silk sliding across wooden tables. The workrooms of castles smelled of hot wax from candles, faint mildew in winter, and crushed herbs scattered to keep moths away. Into that environment, secrets slid easily. To you, embroidery looks decorative. To them, it could become a diary no one dared to read aloud. A council decree proves how regulated clothing could be. In England, sumptuary laws specified what fabrics princesses could wear, how much gold thread was allowed, even what shades of purple signaled direct bloodline to the throne. On the surface, it was about rank, but once you restrict the canvas, people get creative. Hidden among mandated patterns, subversive stitches slipped in. One thread too thin for a king's eye might still speak volumes to a lover in the know. One scandalous aside describes Margaret of Austria, who supposedly sent a gown embroidered with ivy leaves to a knight, rumoured to be her secret admirer. Ivy meant loyalty, but in the subtle symbolism of the time, it also suggested clinging affection. Imagine a knight unfolding fabric, reading it like a letter only he understood. No ink, no parchment, just thread. For a moment, it feels as though the silken codes themselves are alive. You trace your hand along the hem of a dress, and the bumps of gold thread feel almost like braille under your skin. To wear such clothing was to walk wrapped in secrets. To see a princess glittering in candlelight was to wonder what messages shimmered just beyond reach. Oddly enough, some garments went beyond mere thread. Pearls stitched into bodices carried double meanings of purity and hidden eroticism. One account from Burgundy hints that princesses wore gowns where pearls clustered deliberately over the chest, a silent conversation between fashion and desire. Whether that was bold flirtation or simply expensive display, no agreement has been reached on whether these were conscious messages or accidents of style. The sound of a distant bell echoes faintly, as though calling you back from the embroidery hall. You realize how much of this world depended on silence, on unspoken signals woven into the most mundane objects. Dresses could become letters, sashes could become locks, knots could become confessions. The strangest part is that so much of it was hidden in plain sight, brushed off as mere decoration. You picture a young princess waiting in her chamber, her gown heavy with silken codes. Every movement makes the threads glimmer. To the courtiers, she is proper and pious. To the few who know, she is sending messages with every fold of her skirt. Imagine the thrill of secrecy, and the constant risk that someone might decode it incorrectly. A curious footnote in a French chanson describes how ladies embroidered pomegranates, bursting with seeds, into sleeves meant for betrothal ceremonies. Fertility, sensuality, hope of heirs all wrapped in a fruit. Was it bold or simply expected? Scholars still debate, and perhaps the point was never clarity but ambiguity. Codes work best when they hover between innocence and scandal. The texture of silk under your palm lingers even as the scene shifts. The perfume chamber has given way to something stranger still. Bloodlines measured, purity controlled, marriage decrees written in cold ink rather than warm thread. You step from the softness of embroidery into the harder world of royal obsession, where every princess's body is counted, tested, and controlled for dynastic ends. The silk threads fade behind you, and the softness of secret embroidery hardens into something sharper, colder. Your steps echo against a corridor paved with stone, where the smell is no longer of perfume or herbs, but of iron ink and scraped parchment. You're entering the domain where marriage contracts and dynastic rules governed not just who a princess might love, but what her body was meant to guarantee. Records confirm that royal councils across Europe kept meticulous charts of lineage. Princesses were often measured not by personality or learning but by bloodline value, like pedigreed horses. One ledger from the Habsburg court lists young women as if they were chess pieces: name, age, dowry, and suitability for succession. You can almost hear the scratch of the quill, the cold detachment in the scribe's hand. Remarkably, this obsession with purity often went to extremes. In some courts, midwives or trusted matrons examined princesses before marriage, their task to guarantee virginity. Imagine the humiliation of being treated as both treasure and property, with no choice but to comply. What makes your stomach twist is not just the intrusion, but the fact that it was recorded, archived, stamped with wax seals. Scholars still argue whether these examinations were common practice or exceptional to a few paranoid dynasties. Some suggest they were rare and symbolic, more about reassuring political allies than genuine suspicion. Others argue they happened regularly, pointing to repeated references in court protocols. No agreement has been reached, and perhaps the silence around such rituals was deliberate, because who wants to admit that intimacy was policed by bureaucrats? Your mind drifts to one scandalous aside, whispered in French chronicles. A princess accused of having broken her vows of purity before marriage supposedly defended herself by pointing out that her hymen had been damaged by horseback riding. Whether or not it was true, The claim became a popular excuse repeated in ballads and gossip. You almost smile at the idea of horses becoming scapegoats for royal indiscretions. The chamber feels colder as you imagine the weight of dynastic obsession. Bloodlines had to remain untainted, which often meant arranged marriages between cousins. Strangely, rulers knew this caused medical problems, yet the drive for consolidation outweighed common sense. A council decree proves it. Papal dispensations were regularly issued to allow marriages otherwise forbidden by canon law. You picture parchment stamped with red wax, making a cousin into a husband with a flourish of Latin words. What's peculiar is how mythology was sometimes invoked to cover scandal. If a princess gave birth too soon after her wedding, priests might declare the child a miracle, conceived through divine blessing rather than early passion. In Spain, one royal baby was nicknamed El Milagro, precisely because his mother's pregnancy did not match the public timeline. The child survived, but the story lingered like a perfume that wouldn't fade. For a moment, it feels as though you are standing beside a young woman, draped in jewels yet trapped in invisible chains. Every gesture she makes, every smile, every hour of her life is measured against the ledger of bloodline obsession. She may dream of embroidery, of gardens, of whispers at night, but the quill scratches louder. In your ears, the echo changes into the sound of church bells ringing, tolling not for worship but for contract. A marriage isn't sacred love, it's a treaty, sealed in a bedchamber with witnesses waiting outside. You realize how strange it must have been to be told from childhood that your body was a border, your womb a battlefield for dynastic strategy. One curious detail emerges from Italian court records. Physicians were sometimes asked to examine menstrual cycles of princesses before marriage negotiations, as if fertility could be confirmed like a financial audit. To modern ears, it sounds invasive and absurd, but to their world it was logical. You want heirs? You make sure the vessel is sound. Scholars bicker over whether princesses resisted these controls in subtle ways. Some think embroidery, secret perfumes, and coded charms were acts of rebellion, tiny ways to carve agency out of suffocating rules. Others insist most accepted their role, internalizing duty as identity. Perhaps both are true. Perhaps resistance existed, but so quietly that history only catches faint threads. You feel the parchment crinkle under your fingers, as if you've picked up one of those contracts yourself. The ink is dark, the letters ornate, and every word carries centuries of pressure. Princesses were never just women. They were dynasties dressed in silk, scented in musk, catalogued in ledgers. And yet beneath all the contracts and decrees you sense the tension building. Because no matter how tightly controlled the bloodline, no matter how rigid the rules, human desire always seeped in through the cracks. And soon you'll find yourself stepping into a chamber not filled with parchment, but with steam, milk, and sensual ritual that promised to cleanse both body and fate. The scratch of quills and the smell of parchment dissolve, and in their place comes steam warm, misty, almost sweet. You find yourself at the doorway of a tiled chamber where the stone walls glisten with condensation. The scent here is not musk or resin but warm milk, faintly sour, faintly honeyed. A bath has been drawn, and floating in it is not just water but pale milk streaked with petals. This is the ritual of morning milk baths, a practice whispered through courts as both cleansing and curiously sensual. Records confirm that noble households ordered vast amounts of goat's milk, and occasionally even donkey's milk, specifically for the bathing chambers of princesses. The cost alone makes you blink. In one French account, the daily supply for a single bath could drain the yield of several farms. Yet, to the medieval mind, milk promised purity, youth, and fertility, a way of shaping the body not just for health, but for desirability. Curiously, the ritual itself carried undertones far beyond cleanliness. To step into a bath filled with warm milk meant sinking into nourishment itself, as if the princess were both child and mother, receiver and giver. It blurred lines of sensuality, turning hygiene into spectacle. The steam, the softness of the liquid, The sheen it left on skin, it all carried meanings. No one dared to state outright. Arguments split among scholars on whether these baths were genuinely frequent or more symbolic, staged occasionally for guests or on ceremonial mornings. Some argue that records of milk deliveries prove regular practice. Others insist they were rare luxuries, later exaggerated into myth. No agreement has been reached, leaving you to wonder, did princesses actually soak daily? Or was the very idea enough to feed gossip? A scandalous aside surfaces from German chronicles about a princess rumoured to bathe not in plain milk but in a blend of milk and wine. Supposedly, the mixture left her skin flushed and fragrant, a dangerous charm she wielded at court. Whether truth or exaggeration, the thought of lounging in that strange cocktail lingers like a mischievous joke you're not sure you should laugh at. The sensory world of these chambers overwhelms you. Your hand trails across stones slick with condensation, rough, yet warm. You hear the drip of liquid echoing, rhythmic as a lullaby. The scent of sweet milk mixes with rose petals, creating a haze at once maternal and erotic. To step inside feels like entering a womb of luxury, designed as much to display privilege as to cleanse skin. A council decree proves the seriousness behind it. In certain Italian courts, physicians recommended milk baths to fortify the flesh of young noblewomen before marriage. The wording itself sounds both medical and suggestive, as if body preparation was inseparable from sexual readiness. Imagine standing in a pool of white warmth, knowing that your health, your beauty, your desirability all were being measured in the milky haze. What's peculiar is how attendants participated. Servants poured jugs of milk, scrubbed with soft cloths, and sometimes even sang to mask the silence of the ritual. For them, it was work. For the princess, it was exposure. The boundary between care and intimacy blurred in a way you can still feel when you picture the closeness of those hands, the warmth of the cloth, the unspoken knowledge exchanged in silence. One curious detail preserved in Spanish letters describes a queen who demanded almond milk baths during pregnancy, believing the sweet oil would protect both her skin and her unborn child. Whether it worked or not, the symbolism mattered. Almond milk softened the body, soothed nerves, promised continuity of lineage. You realize that the bath itself became a stage where biology, desire, and dynasty performed together. Scholars still bicker over whether men were ever allowed to witness such rituals. Some point to gossip about ambassadors being treated, to glimpses of bathing ceremonies as a form of courtly seduction. Others dismiss these tales as fantasy. But the image persists. A steamy chamber, a royal body half veiled by milk, a political message hidden in sensual display. For a moment it feels as though the steam curls around you personally. You smell the faint tang of milk beginning to sour, the sweetness of crushed petals, the earthy undertone of stone. You hear the faint crackle of a fire warming the bath, and the air presses close against your skin. You can almost imagine sinking into it, your body buoyant, your mind lulled into hazy calm. A scandalous aside insists one princess in Burgundy insisted on milk baths before any diplomatic negotiation, claiming it gave her softness of persuasion. Whether it was placebo or power play, the notion that diplomacy could be soaked into the skin is both laughable and oddly believable. And just when the warmth feels comforting, you notice how it connects to something larger. The milk bath is not only a chamber luxury, it's a ritual tied to cosmic timing. Because what happens next in the story of these princesses isn't just about flesh, but about stars. The baths fade, the steam dissolves, and in its place appears parchment filled with planetary charts. Soon, you will step into the strange world where marriage beds and wedding nights were not only perfumed and bathed, but scheduled according to the skies. The steam of milk fades, the stone walls dry in your imagination, and before you now lies a table scattered with parchment. The ink is fresh, the diagrams strange, circles, lines, stars, and planetary signs that shimmer like secret codes. This is not embroidery, nor perfume, nor milk. This is destiny written in the heavens. Tonight, You learn how sacred astrology governed not only the lives of medieval princesses, but the most private, intimate moments of their existence. Your eyes follow a chart where the moon is drawn as a pale crescent, surrounded by notes in Latin. Records confirm that court astrologers were indispensable in many royal households. No marriage contract, no conception, not even the timing of the wedding night happened without them. These men, and sometimes learned women hidden under clerical titles, claimed to map desire itself through the stars. To your surprise, one English chronicle reveals that a princess's first night with her husband was delayed for weeks because Mars, the planet of heat and passion, was said to be ill-aspected. Imagine the frustration in the bedchamber while courtiers whispered that the stars had forbidden consummation. You can almost hear the exasperated sighs muffled behind heavy curtains. Scholars still debate whether astrology truly shaped decisions or was merely a convenient excuse. Some argue kings and queens were fervent believers, treating charts as divine law. Others suggest astrologers were used politically, offering justification when rulers wanted to delay or accelerate unions. No agreement has been reached, but the effect on the princess herself was real. Her body became a stage where constellations decided the curtain call. A curious footnote survives in Spanish archives. One princess, whose horoscope warned of infertility if she conceived under a waning moon, supposedly scheduled her entire wedding to coincide with a fertile sky. Guests adjusted their travel, priests shifted their sermons, all so that her womb might align with a glowing celestial calendar. Whether it worked or not, her devotion to the stars became the gossip of two courts. For a moment, it feels as though the candlelight flickering across the parchment is really starlight. You imagine the silence of a royal chamber at night when a young woman peers from her balcony, searching for Venus. Does she feel empowered by the alignment or imprisoned by it? The stars twinkle without care, yet here below they carry the weight of kingdoms. The soundscape shifts. You hear the faint scratch of quills as astrologers record planetary hours, the muttered chants of clerks copying horoscopes onto vellum, the creak of leather-bound books closing with finality. In those sounds you realize how official the practice felt. What might look to us like superstition was for them bureaucratic procedure. One scandalous aside from Burgundy tells of an astrologer who deliberately adjusted a princess's horoscope to claim her husband was divinely destined for fidelity. Later, when the husband strayed, courtiers mocked both the astrologer and the princess, suggesting that even the stars could be bribed. You picture the poor woman caught between cosmic promises and earthly humiliation. Remarkably, some charts prescribed not just when but how intimacy should happen. Certain conjunctions were said to favor quick unions, others slow and tender. To modern ears it sounds like astrological fan fiction, but to the medieval princess it was a solemn instruction. Imagine being told that Saturn required restraint, or that Jupiter allowed for laughter, as if the planets themselves choreographed her body. What's peculiar is how secrecy wrapped these charts. Astrologers often wrote in cipher, hiding details so only trusted readers could decode. One surviving manuscript in Prague contains horoscopes, scribbled over with strange symbols, possibly to mask predictions of passion that the church might condemn. Desire was hidden, but never erased. It simply lived in code, like embroidery in silk. Your fingers trace the vellum, rough at the edges, smoother in the middle where ink clings. You sense the pressure of belief. For a princess, the sky above was not merely decoration. It was destiny etched into every breath. Whether she sighed in contentment or lay awake in anxiety, she did so with the conviction that her own passion had been scheduled by stars. Historians bicker over whether women themselves engaged deeply with astrology or if it was imposed upon them by fathers, husbands, and confessors. Some accounts suggest princesses studied charts privately, even commissioning personal horoscopes outside official channels. Others argue they had little agency, receiving instructions second-hand. You imagine both scenarios. One where a young woman clutches a parchment of stars with secret excitement, another where she reluctantly obeys a timetable that silences her own desire. A curious detail surfaces from Italian letters. One bride was warned not to conceive until her horoscope showed Venus in harmony with the moon. She obeyed. Yet when she later bore a child with a limp, rumors spread that she had defied the stars. Blame shifted from biology to astrology, from chance to destiny. You realize how fragile her safety was tied not just to her body but to how the sky was read. In your ears, a faint chant emerges, the monotone hum of clerics reciting prayers to sanctify astrology. Oddly, the church that often condemned divination sometimes permitted it when convenient for dynastic politics. The contradiction lingers like incense smoke. Was it faith? Was it manipulation? Or perhaps both? Woven together like threads in a gown. One scandalous aside claims that Catherine de' Medici consulted astrologers not only for state matters, but for her own romantic affairs. Whether exaggerated or true, the story persisted, painting her as a woman who bent planets to her will. To imagine a princess using stars to script desire gives you pause. Were they victims of astrology, or its quiet masters? The parchment rustles in your hand. You look closer at the diagrams, and the stars seem to shimmer like tiny eyes watching you. The sensation is eerie, but also calming. To believe in astrology meant to find order in chaos, to see desire not as shameful but as written in heaven itself. For women trapped in political marriages, perhaps this was the comfort they needed. Yet as you set down the chart, the starlight fades. Another sound creeps in, the murmur of voices, not of astrologers but of tutors, older men tasked with teaching young princesses. Their words mix philosophy, scripture, and sometimes scandalously something far less academic. You step away from the parchment and toward a chamber where knowledge and temptation blur, where forbidden tutors leave traces more lasting than ink. The rustle of parchment quiets, and into the silence steps a different kind of figure, not an astrologer cloaked in symbols, but a tutor carrying books, scrolls, and the faint scent of dust from the library. The air is dry, faintly musty, and tinged with candle wax. You can almost hear the creak of leather bindings as he places them on a wooden table. This is the world of forbidden tutors, where the line between education and desire sometimes blurred in ways both whispered and scandalous. Records confirm that medieval princesses were often assigned tutors from early adolescence. These men might teach Latin, scripture, music, or philosophy. But imagine the strangeness of those lessons. A girl of 14 or 15, destined to be a pawn in dynastic marriage, sitting alone with a much older man whose voice carried authority, yet also intimacy. The chamber is quiet. The walls listen, and the words spoken become more than grammar drills. Remarkably, some letters from noble courts reveal just how close these relationships could become. A young Bavarian princess once wrote to her tutor about her sweet longing for further instruction, a phrase that historians interpret cautiously. Was she speaking only of Latin verbs, or hinting at something layered beneath? No agreement has been reached, but the ambiguity lingers, like ink smudged by a trembling hand. One scandalous aside survives in a French chronicle about a tutor who supposedly smuggled love notes inside the margins of philosophy texts. When the princess flipped through the pages, she found verses hidden between Aristotle's Ethics and Boethius's musings on fate. The chronicler, with a smirk you can almost hear across centuries, wrote that she learned her grammar in whispers and her rhetoric in sighs. Whether true or just court gossip, the story lingers because it feels too plausible to dismiss. For a moment, it feels as though you are seated at that desk yourself. You run your hand across the rough parchment, the grain catching at your fingertips, and hear the steady voice of a man explaining the nature of virtue or the harmony of the spheres. His breath smells faintly of wine, his robes brush against the table, and you realize how easy it was for lessons to become something else. What's peculiar is how tolerated these situations were until they threatened scandal. Tutors had daily access to princesses in ways even family sometimes did not. They helped them with music practice, corrected their spelling, and listened to their confessions of boredom. The intimacy of such small, repetitive contact could blossom into dangerous attachment. Yet unless a pregnancy or a rumor erupted, No one intervened. It was as if everyone knew, and everyone pretended not to. A council record from Castile proves how seriously things could escalate. One tutor was publicly dismissed after accusations of over-familiar instruction. The official wording is vague, almost comically discreet, but the punishment was real: exile from court and the confiscation of property. Behind those neutral words lies a human story of longing, betrayal, and whispered nights that no decree could erase. To your surprise, not all stories were tragic. Some princesses cherished their tutors as lifelong confidants. One Hungarian queen, raised under the guidance of a cleric who taught her poetry, later sent him embroidered robes as a sign of gratitude, decades after her marriage. Historians still debate whether such gestures were purely platonic or laced with memory of youthful intimacy. Arguments split between cynics and romantics, and you find yourself caught somewhere in between. A curious detail emerges from Venetian archives. Certain tutors were required to swear oaths of chastity before taking positions in female courts. The irony, of course, is that such oaths almost advertised the very risk they were meant to prevent. Why insist on chastity unless the danger of temptation was assumed? You can almost hear the nervous laughter of courtiers drafting those contracts, knowing well that parchment vows were no shield against human desire. In your ears, the lesson continues. Latin phrases mix with a softer murmur, a question about the princess's thoughts, a compliment about her handwriting, a pause longer than necessary as he leans over her shoulder. The candle flickers, casting their shadows close together on the wall. For a young woman raised in a gilded cage, perhaps this proximity felt like freedom. One scandalous aside from England tells of a princess who allegedly ran away with her music tutor, vanishing for days before being dragged back in disgrace. Whether exaggerated or not, the tale illustrates how potent the combination of rhythm, voice, and secrecy could become. Imagine singing scales while your heart beats wildly for reasons far outside the music. Scholars bicker over whether princesses used tutors strategically, as safe outlets for curiosity, or whether they were vulnerable victims of imbalance. Some argue the relationships gave young women rare agency, allowing them to explore emotions otherwise forbidden. Others emphasize the risks, noting how easily reputations could shatter. Perhaps the truth is tangled desire never fits neatly into footnotes. Your nose catches the sharp scent of ink, mixed with the faint smoke of extinguished candles. The lesson is ending. The tutor gathers scrolls, bows, and retreats, leaving the chamber strangely colder in his absence. You imagine the princess staring at the desk long after, her fingers tracing the grooves in the wood where countless pens scratched lines of Latin, and perhaps also scratched lines across her own heart. A remarkable case from Naples mentions a princess who later sponsored her former tutor as a bishop, elevating him into the church hierarchy. Was it gratitude? A guilty secret? Or a way to ensure silence? The archives do not say. You are left with the shadow of a relationship recorded only in hints, half erased yet impossible to ignore. The air shifts again. The musty smell of books dissolves, and in its place wafts a sweeter aroma, thick honey boiling in copper pots, sticky, golden, and strangely medicinal. The tutor fades into memory as you step toward the next chamber of strangeness, a world of honeyed remedies, where alchemy, lust, and folk cures collided to shape the desires and fates of medieval princesses. The scent of ink and parchment recedes, and in its place rises a cloying sweetness thick, golden, and heavy. You follow the smell into a chamber where copper pots bubble with syrup, beeswax candles drip steadily, and servants stir ladles through viscous liquid that clings like amber to every surface. This is the world of honeyed remedies, where sweetness promised both healing and desire, though sometimes it delivered neither. Records confirm that honey was prized not only as food, but as medicine throughout medieval courts. Physicians prescribed it for wounds, coughs, and digestion. But in the chambers of princesses, honey acquired an additional, more intimate role, a substance believed to stir or restrain passion. Recipes written in Latin mix honey with herbs, spices, and curious animal products, claiming to cure frigidity or calm excessive longing. You can almost smell the sharp tang of cinnamon mixing with the sweetness, forming a potion both enticing and unsettling. Curiously, one manuscript from Provence lists a preparation of honey boiled with ground pearls, meant to preserve the bloom of maidenhood. Whether it truly preserved anything at all, or simply lined the coffers of apothecaries, remains uncertain. Yet the imagery lingers. A young woman sipping a glittering draught, swallowing both sweetness and powdered wealth, told it would guard her virtue as surely as walls and locks. Historians still debate how sincerely people believed in such concoctions. Some argue these remedies were genuine attempts at controlling female sexuality, rooted in medical theories about humors and bodily balance. Others suggest they functioned more symbolically, a way for families to reassure themselves that they were doing something to regulate desire. No agreement has been reached, but the ritual mattered. The very act of drinking honey infused with exotic spices carried psychological weight, even if its physical effects were dubious. A scandalous aside survives in Burgundian gossip. One princess allegedly became so fond of her honey tonic that she demanded it daily, and courtiers joked that her sweetness lingered even on her kisses. Whether malicious or admiring, the rumor reveals how quickly remedies could slide into innuendo. Imagine sipping from a goblet while knowing that every swallow would fuel whispers in the hallways. For a moment it feels as though the sweetness coats your tongue. You can almost taste the sticky texture, feel it clinging to the roof of your mouth. Honey, in the medieval imagination, was not innocent. It was a liquid caught between nourishment and temptation, purity and sin. To drink it was to risk becoming both saint and seductress, depending on who was watching. What's peculiar is how these remedies extended beyond ingestion. Honey was applied directly to the skin, mixed with rose oil to soften hands, rubbed into lips as a gloss, or smeared along the body during certain fertility rites. A council decree from Naples proves the seriousness. It ordered apothecaries to regulate the sale of aphrodisiacal honeys, warning that unapproved mixtures might disturb marital harmony. Picture officials standing solemnly in a marketplace, declaring which honey stirred desire legally and which was forbidden. A curious detail comes from English accounts. Jars of honey were sometimes stored in carved ivory boxes shaped like doves or lions, as if the container itself lent power to the substance. The symbolism mattered: doves for love, lions for vigor. Every spoonful became part of a larger story woven between medicine and myth. The soundscape in this chamber is different. You hear the bubbling of pots, the steady buzz of bees escaping through tiny cracks, the clang of copper lids being set aside. Servants stir with long wooden spoons, and the rhythm becomes almost hypnotic. To a princess watching from her cushioned seat, the preparation of remedies may have felt like performance alchemy enacted in miniature, promising to bend the body's secrets. One scandalous aside hints at darker uses. Chronicles from Aragon suggest that honey laced with mandrake root was given to calm women thought to be too passionate. Imagine swallowing that mixture, your lips sticky, your head swimming, your desire muted not by choice but by potion. The cruelty hides beneath the sweetness, like poison folded into candy. Scholars bicker over whether such practices reflect genuine science of the time or covert attempts at control. Was honey truly thought to balance humors, or was it simply an excuse for surveillance of female desire? Some argue the remedies show fear of women's sexuality. Others see them as tools women themselves may have manipulated, choosing when to drink, when to feign, when to play along. You can almost hear the low laughter of ladies in waiting as they share secret recipes, passing folded slips of parchment like contraband. Perhaps they whispered of which honey brew quickened the pulse, which dulled it, which only made one sleepy. Desire became a kitchen experiment, tested in private, gossiped about in corridors, masked by the respectable veneer of medicine. Remarkably, honey appeared even in religious metaphors. Monks compared the Virgin Mary's purity to honey in the comb, sweet, sealed, untouched. To live in such a culture meant that every jar carried double weight, both divine symbol and erotic undertone. Imagine the strangeness of dipping a spoon into a sacred metaphor before breakfast. For a moment, your fingers feel sticky, as though you've dipped them into a bowl of warm honey yourself. The texture clings, refusing to wash away easily. That was the point. Once applied, honey lingered, its presence impossible to ignore. For a princess, the same was true of the remedies and rumors built around them. Once tasted, they stayed in the imagination, shaping how others saw her body, her virtue, her very destiny. One curious footnote reveals that Catherine of Siena, though not a princess but a noblewoman, once wrote letters warning against honeyed deceits of worldly passion. The language resonates, as though everyone of the age understood the symbolic pull of sweetness irresistible, dangerous, and nearly impossible to separate from bodily desire. As you step away from the bubbling pots, the scent of sugar and spice fades, but something else replaces it: the sound of laughter, the shuffle of masks being tied, the rustle of costumes. Honey gives way to disguise. Sweetness dissolves into intrigue. Soon you are no longer in the apothecary chamber, but in a great hall lit by torches, where princesses and courtiers slip on masks to blur identity, allowing scandal and desire to walk hand in hand beneath the music of masquerade. The bubbling pots fade into silence, and now your ears are filled with the sound of lutes tuning, the shuffle of shoes on polished stone, and bursts of laughter rising into the smoky air. Before you stands a hall alive with firelight. Torches flare against gilded walls, chandeliers sway with beeswax candles, and everywhere masks conceal faces. Tonight is not an ordinary gathering. It is a masquerade, and the strangeness of it lies in how anonymity loosened the stiffest chains of medieval courtly life. Records confirm that courts across Italy, France, and the Low Countries hosted masked balls where nobles could mingle freely, identities blurred behind elaborate disguises. To outsiders, they were celebrations of carnival or feast days. But for princesses, these masquerade nights offered something rare: a temporary escape from surveillance. Cloaked in silk and hidden by painted masks, a woman could slip into shadows, flirt with a knight, exchange words forbidden in daylight, or simply laugh without consequence. Remarkably, descriptions of these events read almost like theatre. One Venetian account details princesses dressed as shepherdesses, while noblemen disguised themselves as monks, devils, or even animals. The performance was playful, but beneath the play lived something sharper. A shepherdess mask allowed a royal woman to pretend at innocence while hinting at rustic freedoms she did not have. A devil's mask gave a man license to whisper things he would never dare speak unmasked. What's peculiar is that the very act of wearing a mask was simultaneously liberating and dangerous. A princess could slip her hand into another's without being recognized, but she could also be mistaken, her identity guessed wrong, her reputation risked in the chaos. Scholars still debate whether these events were truly liberating for women or carefully choreographed illusions of freedom. Some argue that beneath the masks, everyone still knew who was who. Others insist anonymity created genuine opportunities for forbidden intimacy. No agreement has been reached, though the uncertainty feels part of the charm. A scandalous aside appears in Chronicles of Burgundy. During one masquerade, a princess supposedly dressed as a pilgrim and slipped into a quiet alcove with a masked knight. Only later did she discover he was not the man she thought, but his rival. The story ends with nothing more than laughter and embarrassment, but gossip clung to her for years. The danger of the mask lay not only in hiding but in revealing the wrong truth. For a moment, it feels as though you are inside the hall yourself. Music swells, tambourines clash, and a flute spirals above the chatter. The air smells of spiced wine and sweat, a mixture that is both festive and overwhelming. Masks gleam in the torchlight painted gold, feathered, glittering with gems. Behind them, eyes glitter too, carrying promises that may or may not last past midnight. A curious detail emerges from Florentine letters. Certain masks were scented, lined with herbs like lavender or rosemary. Imagine breathing through a veil perfumed with sweetness, each breath reminding you that you were someone else, at least for a few hours. The mask became not just disguise, but a transformation of the senses, altering how the wearer moved, spoke, and even thought. In your ears, the music shifts to a slower rhythm, dancers pairing off. A princess, normally hemmed in by etiquette, now laughs freely. She leans closer, whispers into the ear of a masked stranger. For once, the danger of recognition is replaced by the thrill of not knowing. You feel the warmth of the room, the press of bodies, the exhilaration of rules bent almost to breaking. One scandalous aside suggests that some masquerades became so raucous that moralists condemned them as doorways to sin. Preachers thundered against masked balls, warning that behind a false face hides the devil's whisper. And yet, even when condemned, they persisted because for every sermon denouncing them, a dozen courtiers longed for the anonymity that let them escape, if only briefly, from duty. Remarkably, some royal masquerades were even staged to test loyalty. Chronicles of the Valois court hint at kings observing disguised interactions, measuring who sought out whom, which glances lingered too long, which whispers carried weight. Imagine the double bind for a princess, freed by her mask, yet possibly watched more closely than ever. A curious footnote describes how masks themselves sometimes became coded gifts. A nobleman might present a princess with a mask painted in certain colors, implying affection without words. If she accepted and wore it, the gesture spoke volumes. If she tucked it away, silence became rejection. Like embroidery or perfume, the mask turned into language opaque to most, transparent to a few. For a moment you touch the edge of a velvet mask, the fabric soft under your fingertips, yet the feeling strangely oppressive. Behind it, breath grows hot, vision narrows, identity shifts. You realize why the practice was both thrilling and terrifying. To be hidden was to be free, but also to be untethered, floating in uncertainty. Scholars bicker over whether princesses themselves initiated trysts during masquerades or merely responded to bold advances. Some point to letters suggesting women delighted in anonymity as much as men did. Others argue that female participation was exaggerated by gossip, the actual events far tamer than legend. Perhaps the truth rests in between. Some nights were tame, others reckless, and memory blurred them all into scandalous myth. The music rises again, drums thumping, voices laughing louder. You hear the rustle of skirts, the clatter of goblets, the hiss of whispered words slipping through painted smiles. For a few hours, the court becomes a dream, half real, half play. And when the masks come off, what remains is not innocence restored, but secrets gained. Yet even as the laughter fades and masks are untied, the masquerade leaves something behind, a taste of freedom that lingers in memory. For some princesses, it was a brief glimpse of possibility. For others, it was a dangerous slip that shadowed them forever. As you leave the hall, the sound of revelry dissolves into something quieter. The torches fade, the music stills, and you find yourself walking toward a chamber where the mood shifts entirely. Here, the frivolity of masks gives way to something heavier, stranger. Relics of saints, bones in golden cases, charms pressed to flesh in the hope of fertility. The next step carries you from playful masquerade to sacred relics, where desire and piety become indistinguishable. The echoes of drums and laughter fall away as you step into a chamber where the air is heavier, perfumed not with wine or sweat, but with incense sharp, resinous, and faintly choking. The walls are darker here, lined with niches holding reliquaries, gilded boxes, crystal tubes, and carved ivory cases that gleam in candlelight. Inside them rest fragments, bones, teeth, scraps of cloth believed to be holy. And here, among the veils of smoke, medieval princesses sought sacral relics as part of their most intimate rituals. Records confirm that relics were not merely displayed on altars but often carried into royal bedchambers, especially on wedding nights. Chroniclers describe princesses touching fragments of saints' bones or small reliquaries laid on pillows, as if sanctity might shield or bless their bodies. The symbolism was stark. Union was not just marital but cosmic, overseen by God and his saints, there remains close enough to hear whispered prayers. Curiously, one Hungarian inventory lists a reliquary containing the finger bone of Saint Case, Margaret, loaned to a princess, for the assurance of heirs. Imagine lying beneath sheets while a saint's knuckle rested in a jeweled case beside you, its presence both protective and intrusive. Was it comfort, or was it a silent witness no one could escape? Historians still debate whether such practices were meant sincerely as piety or covertly as fertility magic. Some argue relics carried spiritual assurance, weaving sanctity into fragile dynastic hopes. Others suggest they acted as talismans, their supposed holiness disguising folk beliefs about magic objects. Arguments split along these lines, and no agreement has been reached, but the result was the same: bodies entangled with sacred fragments in the dim glow of candles. A scandalous aside comes from a French chronicle where a princess allegedly pressed a relic of the true cross against her bare abdomen on the eve of her wedding. The chronicler writes with both awe and faint mockery, noting that the wood had kissed her before her husband did. The line still startles centuries later, its intimacy both shocking and strangely poetic. For a moment, it feels as though you are standing close enough to smell the relics themselves. Bones wrapped in silk carry a faint, musty odor, ancient and dusty. Cloth fragments smell of resin, soaked in generations of incense. When pressed close, the scent mingles with beeswax and rose oil, creating an atmosphere both holy and unsettling. You breathe it in, and the line between sacred and sensual blurs. What's peculiar is that relics were often gendered. Female saints' bones were thought to protect chastity or ensure fertility, while relics of male saints were invoked for strength and potency. A council decree from Cologne proves it. Certain relics were officially designated for bridal blessings, including veils said to have belonged to Saint Agnes. The decree reads like a catalogue of sacred prescriptions, transforming intimacy into liturgy. A curious detail from Aragonese letters describes a princess who carried a tiny reliquary sewn into her girdle, believing the constant presence of holiness would guard her against temptation. The irony, of course, is that to carry the relic meant to keep temptation ever in mind. You almost smile at the contradiction. The very effort to suppress desire ends up surrounding it with ritual. In your ears, the soft chanting of priests enters the scene. Before certain marriages, chaplains blessed the bed itself, sprinkling holy water and placing relics at its headboard. You imagine the rustle of vestments, the metallic clink of reliquary cases, the muttered Latin prayers, and then silence followed by the awkward reality of two young people, expected to turn ritual into flesh. One scandalous aside tells of an Italian princess who supposedly complained that her marriage bed felt crowded, not with servants or courtiers, but with the saints themselves. "I thought I married a man," she joked, "but I married a convent." Whether apocryphal or true, the line captures the unease of sharing intimacy with sacred witnesses watching from gilded cases. Remarkably, relics were sometimes used, not for blessing but for accusation. If a princess failed to conceive, relics were brought forth again, this time to test her devotion. Was she kissing the bone of the saint correctly? Was she praying enough? Blame shifted from biology to piety, as if failure of heirs meant failure of faith. Imagine the crushing pressure of carrying both dynastic and divine expectation every night. Scholars bicker over whether women themselves believed in the relic's powers or endured them for appearances. Some chronicles hint at princesses sneaking charms of their own herbal amulets tucked under pillows, alongside official relics suggesting a blend of church ritual and folk practice. Others argue the relics were imposed by priests and families, symbols more about control than comfort. The tension between agency and coercion remains unresolved. For a moment, you brush your hand across a jeweled reliquary. The metal is cold, the gems sharp against your skin, the glass smooth. Inside, a bone fragment rests quietly, smaller than your finger yet heavy with meaning. You imagine the young woman beside you, glancing at it nervously as she lies in bed, wondering if its silent presence condemns or blesses her. A curious footnote lingers from English records. Relics were sometimes swapped like political gifts, passed from one court to another for weddings. Alongside gold and land, a saint's tooth might travel hundreds of miles, carefully packed in velvet. The irony is hard to miss. Kingdoms rose and fell not only on dowries and armies, but on bones rattling in ornate boxes. As the incense grows thicker, your vision blurs. The chamber darkens, and you feel the weight of centuries of prayers layered into the air. Yet even in this sanctity, you sense the undercurrent of desire, the human need that relics could never fully control. Princesses might touch bones, kiss glass, whisper prayers, but behind all the ritual their hearts still beat fast with fear, longing, or resistance. And so you leave the chamber of relics, stepping back into air, less heavy, less holy, though no less strange. Because what waits next is another theatre of desire, not sacred bones this time, but veils. Fabric once more, but not embroidered with codes. Instead, veils turned faces into mysteries, transforming seduction into political performance. The incense fades behind you, though it lingers faintly in your nose, and now a different kind of fabric rises into view. You stand in a chamber lit with soft candlelight, where silk veils ripple in the draught from narrow windows. They hang like ghosts, some translucent, some thick with embroidery, some edged with gold thread. Tonight the veils are not for mourning, nor for piety, but for games. Veil games, where seduction became a spectacle, and politics dressed itself in layers of gauze. Records confirm that veils were central to medieval royal fashion. A princess rarely appeared without her head covered, her hair hidden beneath linen or silk. But at court festivals, veils became playful tools. One account from Burgundy describes a banquet where princesses wore multiple veils of different colors, removing one after each toast, not unlike petals falling from a flower. To the sober-minded, it was entertainment. To the whispering courtiers, it was scandal disguised as ritual. Curiously, one German poem depicts a game in which men were blindfolded with a princess's veil and asked to guess her identity by touch alone. Whether the detail is satire or a real pastime, you can hear the suppressed giggles, the shuffling of chairs, the thrill of mixing propriety with daring contact. Imagine a man's hand grazing fabric he is not supposed to feel, while the woman hides behind her veil, safe and yet exposed at once. Historians still argue whether these veil games were staged only in courtly poetry or acted out in real halls. Some suggest they were metaphors for chivalric longing, never practiced beyond ink. Others believe fragments of chronicles confirm that such amusements truly occurred at feasts. No agreement has been reached, leaving the veil itself suspended between symbol and reality, as uncertain as the face it conceals. One scandalous aside comes from a French court record in which a princess allegedly traded veils during a festival, giving hers to a knight and wearing his scarf in return. The act might sound harmless, but to contemporaries it was charged with meaning. An exchange of fabric was a silent pledge of loyalty, almost like a marriage vow whispered in cloth. Rumors flew, reputations shifted, and the princess's father spent months quashing gossip. For a moment, it feels as though you are standing in the hall yourself. Music hums faintly from a harp. The air smells of beeswax and wine, and veils flutter like butterflies. Each piece of fabric softens the face it hides, turning eyes into shadows, smiles into mysteries. When you look through the veil, the world blurs, and you realize how seductive obscurity can be half revealed, half denied, a tease built into the very weave. What's peculiar is how veils were used in both sacred and profane spaces. A council decree from Milan proves that brides were required to wear veils during wedding ceremonies, so that humility may guard the threshold of union. Yet the same garment might be tossed playfully aside at a banquet, turning humility into spectacle. One object, two meanings, endlessly shifting with the moment. A curious detail survives in Venetian letters. Some veils were perfumed before festivals, steeped in lavender water, or dusted with crushed amber. When a princess danced, the veil's movement left a scented trail, like invisible writing in the air. To breathe that scent was to follow a story told only to those near enough to inhale it. In your ears you hear the rustle of silk as women draw veils tighter or let them slip lower. The gesture itself becomes performance. To adjust a veil could mean modesty, but done slowly it could mean invitation. Every movement was a conversation without words, a message woven in fabric. One scandalous aside hints at darker games. In a Neapolitan chronicle, a drunken noble supposedly tried to tear away a princess's veil during a feast, claiming he had the right to see her face. She slapped him with her goblet, and the scandal ended in brawls. The veil, in that moment, was no longer play, but a shield, fragile yet fierce. Remarkably, veils sometimes travelled as diplomatic gifts. A Florentine ambassador once presented a princess with a chest of sheer silk veils from the East, noting in his report that the cloth revealed while it concealed. To send such an object was to acknowledge both piety and seduction, offering a gift that could veil a prayer one day and a smile the next. For a moment, your own fingers brush against one of the fabrics. It is so light it slips through your grasp, almost weightless, yet the power it carries is heavy. Behind it, a face hides. Behind it, reputations shift. Behind it, desire smoulders in semi-darkness. The veil, so thin, becomes a wall between duty and play. Scholars bicker over whether princesses themselves initiated veil games to carve moments of autonomy, or if they were drawn reluctantly into spectacles arranged by men. Some argue the act of lowering a veil deliberately was itself a form of rebellion, a choice in a world of constraints. Others claim the games reinforced control, reminding women that even their faces could be made into public theatre. Perhaps both are true, the veil's ambiguity ensuring it was always both prison and tool. The candles flicker, and you imagine a hall full of veiled faces, laughter echoing as cloth slips and slides. The game seems harmless, yet beneath it lies the truth of courtly life. Nothing was ever simply what it seemed. A veil might hide a blush, or it might invite a touch. A mask might conceal scandal, or it might reveal longing. And just as you settle into the softness of fabric and the whispers of veils, the sound shifts again. The hall grows silent, and you hear the clatter of hooves in a courtyard, the arrival of emissaries from distant lands. Exotic fabrics, jewels, and strange customs enter the palace. The veils are folded away, and before you rise, the gifts of foreign visitors, objects and expectations that would bring yet another layer of strangeness into the intimate lives of princesses. The last veil slips away into shadow, and now you hear a new sound, the clatter of hooves on cobblestones, the rattle of carts at the palace gates. The air shifts as foreign visitors arrive, bringing with them gifts, expectations, and customs that seem half enchanting, half unsettling. A breeze follows them in, carrying scents unfamiliar to the court, spices sharp as pepper, resins thick as tar, and fabrics dyed in shades no local dyer could imitate. You stand at the edge of a great hall, watching princesses step forward to receive these emissaries, their lives once again bent beneath the weight of diplomacy, disguised as hospitality. Records confirm that diplomatic exchanges often revolved around exotic objects. Ambassadors from Byzantium, the Levant, and even further east delivered silks that shimmered with impossible colors, perfumes distilled from rare flowers, and jewels that caught the light like frozen stars. For the princesses who received them, these gifts were not mere luxuries, they were tools. A silken robe might imply political alignment, a jar of oil might carry rumors of fertility, a necklace might spark whispers of betrothal. Each gift had meaning, often layered with insinuations no one could afford to ignore. Curiously, some gifts carried associations so strange they bordered on scandal. A chronicle from Paris records the arrival of a gilded bed sent by a North African ruler, its frame inscribed with verses about love and pleasure. The princess who received it blushed, and courtiers laughed uneasily, unsure whether the gift was an insult, an invitation, or simply a cultural misunderstanding. The bed, unused, stood as a symbol of awkward diplomacy, too suggestive to sleep in, too costly to discard. Historians still debate whether foreign emissaries deliberately chose gifts with sensual undertones or if cultural differences created accidental provocations. Some scholars argue that ambassadors used subtle erotic symbolism to flatter or unsettle royal women. Others insist the items were neutral in their homeland, only interpreted scandalously in Europe. No agreement has been reached, but the tension at court is easy to imagine: every gift, a gamble, every acceptance, a negotiation. One scandalous aside emerges from Venetian gossip. A princess was said to have received a caged songbird from an Ottoman envoy. The bird sang only at night, and rumors swirled that its cries were timed to her visits to the aviary. Whether coincidence or deliberate showmanship, courtiers whispered of enchanted gifts, hinting at secret longing that crossed borders. The princess's reputation fluttered as uneasily as the bird's wings. For a moment, it feels as though you are running your hands across the fabrics yourself. Brocades thicker than local cloth, silks smooth as water slipping between your fingers, jewels cool against your skin. Each sensation carries both allure and unease, as if every object demands interpretation. To wear an Eastern perfume is not just to smell exotic, it is to risk being called foreign-hearted, too enthralled by outsiders. What's peculiar is how quickly these gifts seeped into courtly rituals. A council decree in Aragon proves that imported oils were to be tested by physicians before use, lest potions disguised as perfumes disturb the balance of humours. The fear was clear. What if foreign luxuries carried not only strange scents but dangerous powers? The line between diplomacy and sorcery was thin, especially when women's bodies were involved. A curious detail survives in Florentine letters, describing a princess who received a small glass vial of amber oil. It was said to stir the blood when applied to the skin. The princess wore it once, at a feast, and the chronicler claimed the entire hall grew restless, as though intoxicated by her presence. Was it the oil, or the rumor of the oil, that unsettled the court? Perhaps both. The power of belief mattered as much as the substance itself. In your ears you hear the layered accents of ambassadors, their voices booming in foreign cadences across the hall. The princess listens, nodding politely, while her ladies-in-waiting gossip behind fans. Every word, every bow, every presentation of a gift carries undertones. A scarf laid at her feet might be mere courtesy, or it might hint at surrender, alliance, or forbidden desire. One scandalous aside tells of a Polish princess who received ivory combs carved with entwined lovers. The combs were praised for their craftsmanship, yet hidden in the design was a sensuality impossible to miss. Courtiers whispered that to run them through her hair was to summon lust itself. Whether she ever dared to use them is unknown, but the combs remained in her treasury for decades, silent witnesses to whispered interpretations. Remarkably, foreign visitors often brought not only objects but new ideas of beauty and intimacy. In some cases, cosmetics, unfamiliar to local courts, arrived with ambassadors: kohl to darken eyes, henna to stain fingertips, scented powders to smooth skin. Imagine the curiosity of a princess experimenting in secret, her reflection transformed in candlelight, her beauty suddenly marked by influences her family both envied and feared. Scholars bicker over whether such influences empowered princesses by giving them new tools of self-presentation or trapped them further, making them exotic spectacles for their courts. Some argue foreign perfumes and fabrics gave women agency, letting them control how they appeared. Others insist they increase scrutiny, every choice dissected for political or moral meaning. Perhaps both are true, for in the glittering halls of power, gifts were never free of consequence. For a moment, you catch the scent of foreign resin burning in a censer, mingling with the heavier musk of local perfumes. The combination is intoxicating, both sweet and bitter, like two cultures clashing in the air itself. You imagine standing in that hall, veiled faces peeking over fans, eyes glancing at ambassadors, hearts beating faster not just with attraction but with fear of missteps. A curious footnote in Burgundian records describes a princess who returned a gift of rare figs, claiming they were too ripe. The gesture insulted the envoy, sparking a diplomatic rift. A fruit basket became a weapon, its sensual undertone transformed into political rejection. You laugh softly at the absurdity. Kingdoms shaken by figs. And yet, beneath all the laughter and scandal, you sense the deeper truth. Foreign visitors embodied the unknown. For princesses whose lives were tightly bound, these emissaries carried not only luxuries but glimpses of other possibilities. To hold an exotic jewel was to touch a world beyond castle walls. To smell resin from distant deserts was to dream of landscapes never seen. As the ambassadors bow and gifts are gathered, the hall grows quieter. The princess returns to her chamber, her hands still carrying the scent of strange oils. The foreign voices fade into silence, replaced by something more familiar: whispers through wooden lattice, murmurs in shadowy booths. The next chamber you step toward is one of confession, where veils of piety hide temptations of their own, and where priests themselves are caught between secrecy and desire. The shuffle of foreign voices fades, and the atmosphere tightens into something hushed, almost claustrophobic. You find yourself standing before a wooden lattice, the air heavy with wax smoke and damp stone. The faint aroma of incense clings to the chamber, mixed with the sharper scent of iron hinges and polished wood. This is no banquet hall or perfumed chamber. It is the confessional booth, where whispers pass between sinner and priest, where secrecy and temptation knot together in ways both holy and troubling. Household accounts make clear that princesses were expected to confess regularly, often more often than ordinary subjects. Their spiritual purity was seen as symbolic of dynastic stability. Imagine kneeling on a cold wooden bench, silk skirts pooling around you, while a priest leans close on the other side of the screen. His voice is measured, his questions probing. To admit sins here was not only about the soul, it was about surveillance disguised as salvation. What's striking is that confessors wielded enormous influence over young women of rank. Chronicles of the Aragonese court describe one friar who spent hours behind the lattice with a princess, guiding her through lists of impure thoughts. Rumors spread quickly. Were his questions purely pastoral, or did they dwell too long on the very subjects they condemned? You can almost hear the nervous laughter of courtiers, debating whether piety and curiosity had merged too comfortably in the shadows of the booth. Researchers remain divided on whether confessors deliberately exploited these situations, or if scandalous tales were exaggerated by gossip. Some historians argue the intimacy of confession bred genuine temptation, while others suggest the stories reflect anxieties about female vulnerability rather than actual misconduct. The evidence is contested, leaving no consensus, but the fact that such rumors persisted hints at how fragile the boundary was between guidance and intrusion. Courtly tongues wagged over one particular episode in Burgundy. A princess supposedly slipped her veil through the lattice, letting her confessor kiss it as proof of her contrition. Whether it happened or was invented by enemies, the tale painted the booth as both sacred and strangely erotic. Imagine the fabric damp with breath, caught halfway between sin and absolution. For a moment, it feels as though you are kneeling there yourself. The wood beneath your hands is rough, the candlelight dim, the booth smelling of old polish and sweat. A voice murmurs questions. Have you thought of forbidden things? Have you longed for what is not yours? Each answer makes your throat dry. Every pause feels like a secret, waiting to be caught or forgiven. An unusual note appears in Florentine letters, where a princess confessed so frequently that her attendants teased her for spending more time with her priest than with her music. The remark may have been playful, but it reveals how confession was watched as much as performed. Even privacy became public performance, once whispered back into the corridors of court. The sensory atmosphere deepens. You hear the low rasp of a priest's voice, the occasional sigh, the scratch of quill on parchment when notes were taken. Confession was supposed to be confidential, Yet scribes sometimes recorded penances in ledgers. Imagine your own sins archived like tax receipts, tucked into dusty drawers for bishops to review. A ribald rumor whispered through French chronicles claimed that one confessor advised a princess to fast from meat but indulge in sweets, hinting slyly that honey cleanses the soul's fire. Whether jest or true instruction, the phrase spread like wildfire, transforming into a proverb repeated mockingly by courtiers. To them, the booth was less holy than hilarious, its walls too thin to guard against satire. Academic opinion splits sharply on whether confession offered women a space of empowerment where they could voice thoughts otherwise forbidden, or whether it reinforced control, trapping them in cycles of guilt. Some scholars emphasize the therapeutic release of whispering doubts into the dark. Others underline the danger of dependency, of confessional intimacy turning into manipulation. Both perspectives illuminate the booth as a site where silence spoke as loudly as words. For a moment, you can almost smell the breath of the priest through the lattice, tinged with wine and herbs. The veil between you is thin, not only in wood but in symbolism. It both separates and connects, creating a paradox, distance that feels like closeness, secrecy that invites confession. A rare anecdote from Neapolitan records notes that some princesses requested female confessors nuns with special license claiming they felt safer. Yet such requests were often denied, reinforcing the Church's hold. The denial itself reveals the anxiety of male authorities, unwilling to cede even this most private channel of influence. And when absolution came, when the priest murmured ego te absolvo, it was not only the soul that felt lighter. For many women, this was the only place where forbidden thoughts could be voiced aloud, wrapped in the assurance of forgiveness. Yet the paradox lingered. The very act of confessing impurity meant reliving it, whispering it into another man's ear. The booth grows darker in your imagination, the smoke thicker, the air colder. You sense the tension between purity and peril, pressing down like the weight of stone above. And then, just as you strain to listen harder, the silence shifts. Dreams, not confessions, begin to intrude. Whispers dissolve into visions, and soon you are drawn into the next chamber of strangeness. Celestial dreams, where princesses claimed their desires came not from flesh, but from angels or demons in the night. The wooden lattice and whispered penances dissolve, and in their place comes the weight of sleep, a different kind of secrecy, one that visits when candles burn low and chambers fall silent. You are standing at the edge of a bed heavy with brocade, the curtains drawn tight. A faint draught brings the scent of lavender stuffed into the mattress, mixed with beeswax from guttering candles. Here, in the stillness of midnight, princesses surrendered to something even stranger than confession. Celestial dreams, visions that blurred the line between divine visitation and erotic fantasy. Contemporary documents reveal that dream interpretation held enormous sway in the medieval imagination. Physicians, priests, and scholars alike treated visions of the night as messages from heaven or omens of sin. For princesses raised under constant scrutiny, dreams offered a loophole. One could not be blamed for what visited in sleep. A body might remain untouched, yet desire could slip in on angels' wings. What's striking is how often chronicles describe these visions with language too vivid to be purely symbolic. A Saxon princess reported to her confessor that an angel touched her lips in a dream, warming her as no fire could. The priest dutifully recorded it as divine blessing, yet the phrasing lingers with unmistakable sensual undertones. Was it prayer, or longing cloaked in celestial language? Scholars quarrel over whether such accounts reflect genuine belief or artful storytelling. Some argue these dream visions were coded ways for women to explore desire in a society that forbade direct speech. Others insist they were genuine spiritual experiences, later tainted by cynical readers. The debate remains unresolved, leaving the dreams suspended in half-light, like the flicker of candle flames on silk curtains. Courtly, tongues wagged over a French princess who swore she saw Saint Michael in her sleep, instructing her to marry a knight she already favored. The dream was repeated so often at court that it became a form of propaganda, painting her attraction as heavenly sanction. You can almost hear the sly chuckles of courtiers wondering whether the saint or the suitor truly inspired her vision. For a moment, it feels as though you are lying in that bed yourself. The sheets cool against your skin, the air heavy with the muffled sound of distant bells. Sleep hovers, fragile, and then an image presses into your mind, wings rustling, voices whispering, touches you cannot quite name. Dreams in this age were never simply private. They were stages where heaven and desire rehearsed their parts together. An unusual note appears in Iberian records, where a princess described nightly battles with demons who visited her bed. To her confessor, she explained that these dark figures tried to steal her breath. The account drips with dread, yet modern readers hear another story hiding beneath. The language resembles descriptions of nocturnal passion, veiled as spiritual struggle. Remarkably, dream books circulated widely among noble households, offering guides to interpretation. One might say, to dream of roses means love, to dream of fire means passion, to dream of water means fertility. Imagine a princess waking and rushing to her ladies-in-waiting, whispering of a stream or a rose, the chamber buzzing with speculation. Desire became a puzzle, cloaked in allegory, safer when spoken through symbols. A mischievous chronicle from Burgundy records a rumor that a certain princess claimed the Virgin Mary herself appeared in her dreams, instructing her to resist her husband's advances. Courtiers found the story both shocking and hilarious. What better excuse for marital reluctance than divine command delivered in sleep? Yet the tale reveals how visions could be used not only to justify desire but also to deflect it. In your ears you hear the soft rustle of curtains stirring as if with wings. The chamber smells faintly of rosewater sprinkled before bed, meant to cool the body. You sense the vulnerability of lying half asleep between consciousness and surrender. In that twilight, saints and demons alike could become convenient masks for what the body already longed to feel. Researchers remain divided on whether princesses themselves cultivated these visions, fasting, praying, or using herbs to encourage vivid dreams, or whether the experiences were simply embroidered later into legend. Some specialists argue that mugwort and henbane, common in medieval sleep remedies, induced hallucinations mistaken for visions. Others counter that even if chemically induced, the meanings still mattered deeply to those who lived them. A rare anecdote surfaces in English chronicles. One princess confessed she dreamed nightly of a faceless figure who held her hand but never spoke. Interpreters argued endlessly, was it Christ, a future husband, or temptation made flesh? The mystery was never solved, but the dream haunted her reputation as surely as any rumor of flesh and blood scandal. For a moment, the line between your own waking and dreaming blurs. You smell candle smoke, you feel linen sheets, you hear wings that might be doves, or might be demons. The strangeness of it is how ordinary such experiences were considered. A princess could wake flushed and trembling, yet claim innocence, for it was only a dream. And yet the chamber grows darker still, and the visions twist into envy. You hear faint laughter from beyond convent walls, women singing psalms with fervor that outsiders could not touch, princesses peering into cloisters, often longed for the forbidden intensity of religious life. Your steps now carry you from the dream-soaked bed into stone halls where cloister envy blooms, and princesses measure their own restless desires against the chaste mysteries of convent walls. The dream curtains dissolve into stone, and suddenly you stand in the cool echo of a cloister. The air is damp, laced with the scent of wax smoke, garden herbs, and faint chalk dust from cloister walls. Footsteps click against flagstones, and you hear the steady hum of women's voices chanting psalms in unison. This is not a palace hall nor a perfumed chamber. It is the convent, and for many medieval princesses, it became both an object of envy and a forbidden fantasy. Archival notes show that convents offered rare autonomy for women, a life apart from the endless cycle of dynastic duty. Princesses, bound to marriages that often felt like cages, sometimes gazed longingly at cloister walls, Inside, women ruled their own spaces. Abbesses wielded economic power, nuns managed property, and daily rhythms were set by prayer rather than politics. For a royal woman accustomed to surveillance, the idea of enclosure could seem like freedom. An unusual note appears in Chronicles of Brabant. A princess reportedly lingered at convent visits far longer than etiquette allowed, asking endless questions about the daily routines of nuns. Courtiers later whispered that she envied their simple dress and nightly chants. To outsiders, it was piety. To insiders, it looked suspiciously like yearning. Scholars quarrel over what kind of yearning these visits truly reflected. Some argue it was purely spiritual longing, a hunger for the contemplative life. Others suggest something more physical, the emotional intensity of convent relationships, the bonds between women who touched, prayed, and slept side by side. The evidence is fragmentary, and interpretation splits sharply between visions of holiness and whispers of forbidden desire. Courtly tongues wagged about a Burgundian princess who confessed she envied the nuns' freedom to embrace one another openly without scandal. In her court, a touch of the hand might spark rumors of impropriety. In the cloister, embraces were normal, woven into ritual. You can almost hear her sigh, half in jest, half in desperation. How enviable! To touch without fear. For a moment, it feels as though you are walking those cloister corridors yourself. The stones are cold underfoot, the air tinged with rosemary from the gardens. In one corner, novices copy manuscripts, their fingers smudged with ink. In another, a nun tends roses, the petals damp with dew. The environment is austere, yet it pulses with an intimacy denied to the courts outside. What's striking is how convents sometimes became sanctuaries for unwanted brides. A council decree from Cologne proves that noble families occasionally retired daughters there to avoid scandal or escape mismatched marriages. Yet for the princesses themselves, the cloister could feel like both exile and liberation. Imagine the mix of grief and relief when the heavy doors closed, sealing off the outside world. A curious detail surfaces from Florentine letters. A princess once sent gifts of silk ribbons to a convent, requesting they be tied into the hair of her favorite nun. The gesture blurred charity and affection, offering a glimpse into attachments that ran deeper than devotion. To gift silk was to declare intimacy without words. The sensory world intensifies. You hear the scrape of a quill across parchment, the hiss of a censer swinging during compline, the low hum of women's voices weaving into harmony. Each sound carries calm, but also something more magnetic, a rhythm of life outside male control. For a princess whose body was measured for heirs, the cloister was a parallel universe, and envy grew sharper with every glimpse. A ribald rumor whispered in French court circles told of a princess sneaking into a convent at night dressed as a servant, hoping to experience the chants firsthand. The story was half satire, half admiration. Whether true or not, it reveals how much fascination cloisters held not just as holy places, but as dreamscapes of alternate possibilities. Remarkably, convent manuscripts themselves sometimes hint at noble women's ambiguous attachments. One psalter copied by nuns contains marginal drawings of entwined female figures, their faces serene, their hands clasped. Was it allegory, artistic flourish, or perhaps a subtle confession? Historians remain divided, but the images leave open a possibility that shadows the chants with something more earthly. For a moment, you touch the chill of the cloister wall, rough stone beneath your palm. You can imagine the princess doing the same, leaning against stone, listening to the psalms, feeling a longing she could never voice aloud. The envy was not just for faith, but for the intimacy. Faith seemed to allow women behind those walls. A rare anecdote survives from Aragon. A queen, visiting a convent, remarked that the nuns looked younger than their years, their skin unlined. She attributed it to the peace of their lives, but courtiers whispered she was comparing them to herself, aged by politics, childbearing, and court intrigue. Envy seeped into every observation, cloaked as piety. And so you leave the cloister, the chants fading behind you, though the longing they evoked lingers like incense on your clothes. As you walk away, the sound of psalms shifts into something more ordinary, the shuffle of servants' feet, the whisper of cloth against cloth. Soon you are in the princess's private chamber again, where attendants lace her bodice, brush her hair, and perform tasks that blur the line between duty and intimacy. What awaits next is the strangeness of daily rituals, dressing and undressing, where touch itself became a performance no less charged than dreams or cloisters. The cloister fades into memory, its chants dissolving into silence, and you find yourself in a more intimate space, a princess's chamber at dawn. The shutters are half closed, letting in thin bars of light. The air smells faintly of damp linen, beeswax, and the lavender sachets tucked into trunks. Around the bed stand women with busy hands, ladies-in-waiting and chambermaids, bustling softly as they prepare their mistress for another day. This is the world of dressing servants, where routine tasks of combing hair and lacing gowns carried layers of awkward intimacy, whispered gossip, and unspoken power. Court registers leave no doubt that noblewomen never dressed or undressed themselves alone. Princesses were accompanied at nearly every private moment, their bodies inspected, adjusted, and displayed by the touch of attendants. For the servants, it was work, pulling stiff brocade into place, fastening jeweled girdles, smoothing chemises. For the princess, it was daily exposure, her flesh always half public, her modesty constantly negotiated. A curious note appears in Burgundian household accounts describing mourning gowns, cut deliberately loose, meant to be worn during these rituals. The fabric was soft, light, and sometimes sheer garments designed not for courts but for the hands of servants who would remove them within minutes. To slip into such clothing was less about fashion than about managing the touch of others. Scholars quarrel over how these daily rituals were perceived. Some argue they created spaces of female bonding, where attendants and princesses shared jokes, songs, and secrets in the privacy of the chamber. Others insist they reinforced hierarchy. Each button fastened a reminder of who served and who ruled. The truth probably wove between both extremes. Tenderness threaded with control, laughter edged with silence. Contemporary gossip claimed that some attendants became confidants in matters far beyond wardrobe. One English chronicle hints at a princess who confessed her fears about marriage, while a servant brushed out her hair. The act of untangling knots became a metaphor for untangling the heart, the brush strokes steady, as the conversation drifted into forbidden territory. For a moment, it feels as though you are in the room yourself. You hear the creak of a wooden chest opening, the hiss of fabric as it slides free, the faint gasp of a maid tugging a corset too tightly. Fingers press against laces, palms flatten fabric across skin, and the closeness is undeniable. Imagine standing still while others circle you, their hands arranging your body as if you were both doll and queen. What's striking is how much could be read into these ordinary gestures. To lace a bodice too tightly might be taken as jealousy, to brush hair too gently as affection. A council record from Florence even warns against unseemly familiarity between noblewomen and their attendants, proof that authorities feared the intimacy of such closeness. The line between duty and desire was thin, drawn with thread and comb. A ribald rumour whispered through French courts told of a servant who kissed the hem of a princess's shift while fastening her gown. The story scandalized some, amused others, and lingered in songs sung by gossipy minstrels. Whether true or fabricated, it reveals how much imagination swirled around those daily encounters. Remarkably, some princesses themselves seem to have leaned into the intimacy of ritual. A Venetian letter describes one who refused male physicians in favor of female attendants trained in healing arts. They rubbed oils into her skin, combed her hair with scented combs, and whispered charms while they worked. To outsiders, it looked like superstition. To her, perhaps it felt like control over her own body, at least in the privacy of the chamber. The sensory details grow sharper. You can feel the tug of laces at your ribs, the prickle of comb teeth against your scalp, the cool touch of rings slipped onto your fingers. You can smell the starch of linen, the faint musk of wool, the rosewater sprinkled on shifts before wearing. Dressing was never just mechanical. It was performance for an audience of servants who saw every freckle, every scar, every tremor of breath. An unusual anecdote from Castile records that one princess rewarded her attendants with leftover perfumes and ribbons, claiming, "They deserve sweetness for enduring me." The line sounds playful, but it also reveals awareness. She knew their work meant intimacy with her moods, her body, her vulnerability. Dressing and undressing was not only exposure of flesh, but of temperament, witnessed daily. Researchers remain divided on whether these rituals were empowering or humiliating. Some argue they offered women a circle of solidarity within the confines of court life. Others stress how power dynamics could not be erased, with every touch reminding servants of their lowly status and princesses of their constant dependence. The debate itself mirrors the duality of the chamber, comfort intertwined with control. For a moment, you imagine the chamber emptying, the attendants gone, the princess left alone at last. She exhales, tugging lightly at her gown as though reclaiming her body from the hands that dressed it. The solitude lasts only minutes before duty calls, but it must have felt like a stolen breath in a life otherwise dictated by others. And just as the scene settles, the sound shifts again. The brushing and lacing give way to murmurs, incantations, charms muttered into pillows, words half prayer, half spell. You step away from the chamber of cloth and combs into the world of whispered folk magic, where princesses turned not to priests or servants but to charms of their own, muttered softly in the dark. The clatter of buckles and combs drifts into silence, replaced by something softer, a murmur in the dark. You find yourself in a chamber lit only by a single taper, its smoke curling faintly into the rafters. The sheets of the princess's bed are turned down, and she leans close to the pillow as though it might answer her. These are whispered charms, fragments of folk belief muttered at night. Half prayer, half spell. The secret world of murmured words meant to bend desire or banish fear. Contemporary documents reveal that even the most pious courts could not escape superstition. Alongside relics and liturgies, princesses sometimes whispered, phrases taught by nurses or servants, words passed down through generations of women. These charms were not written in official records but survive in stray notes, slips of parchment tucked in chests, margins of prayer books, or confessions reluctantly recorded by priests. They range from the innocent prayers for restful sleep to the daring phrases meant to attract or restrain passion. What's striking is how earthy and simple these charms could be. One Italian collection records a princess repeating 3 times before sleep, "As this pillow holds my head, so may my love hold me." To a priest, it might look harmless. To her, it was a talisman, a way of directing longing into language. The words, breathed into linen, felt safer than saying them aloud in the day. Academic opinion splits sharply on whether such charms were believed literally or used symbolically. Some scholars argue that women genuinely thought they carried power, woven into the fabric of nightly ritual. Others suggest they served more as emotional release, a way to voice forbidden feelings under cover of darkness. Either way, the practice itself reveals how little separation there was between prayer and spell, piety and desire. Courtly tongues wagged over one scandalous anecdote. A Burgundian princess supposedly placed her hand beneath her pillow each night, whispering a charm that her future husband would be gentle in the bed and fierce in the field. When word leaked, courtiers chuckled at her honesty, though the detail also unsettled them. To imagine a princess commanding both passion and valor through whispered words was to glimpse a woman's will rarely admitted in daylight. For a moment, it feels as though you are kneeling by that bed yourself. The linen smells faintly of lavender, the wood frame creaks when you shift, and the candle sputters. Your lips form silent syllables, the rhythm soothing as breath. The quiet repetition makes your eyelids heavy. You realize how such rituals could blur into sleep, leaving the dream to complete what the charm began. An unusual note appears in French household inventories. small pouches filled with herbs, thyme, sage, or rue tucked under pillows, to ward off restless thoughts. Some were stitched with red thread, others knotted 3 times for luck. Whether you call it medicine or magic, the act of whispering words while clutching such a pouch made the unseen feel tangible. You imagine the faint crackle of dried herbs beneath cloth, the scent seeping upward with each breath. Remarkably, charms sometimes involved silence as much as sound. A Castilian account mentions a princess who wrote her wish for love on a strip of parchment, kissed it, and placed it under her pillow without speaking a word. By morning the ink had blurred with sweat, but she insisted the silence made it more binding. You can almost see her folding the slip carefully, her face half fearful, half hopeful. A mischievous chronicle records how one confessor grew suspicious of the princess he advised, noting she always appeared too serene after nights of restless prayer. When pressed, she admitted to whispering charms. The priest denounced them as demonic, but she defended herself with a smile. If demons grant peaceful sleep, perhaps they are gentler than men. The remark, half joke, half defiance, scandalized the court, but the line survived in gossip long after. The sensory details deepen. The rough feel of embroidered pillowcases under fingertips, the musty scent of straw-filled mattresses, the faint hiss of wind through shutters. Into that darkness, whispered syllables carried the weight of both rebellion and resignation. A princess might not control treaties or bloodlines, but she could still murmur a charm, staking out a pocket of power in the night. Researchers remain divided on whether such rituals gave women true agency or were dismissed as childish superstition by those around them. Some emphasize the courage of carving space for private expression. Others see it as evidence of constraint, proof that women's power had to remain hidden in whispers. The tension between those interpretations lingers, much like the charms themselves, fragile but enduring. A rare anecdote from Hungarian records tells of a princess who whispered charms not for herself but for her lady-in-waiting, hoping to secure her friend's happiness in marriage. The act reveals another layer. Charms were not only personal but communal, shared between women as gestures of affection and solidarity. Each whispered line built invisible bonds stronger than stitches or contracts. For a moment, the hush of the chamber grows heavier. You hear the last crackle of candlewick before darkness swallows the room. Breath steadies, words fade, and the pillow cools against your cheek. The whispered charms linger in air that feels thick, half sacred, half profane. And then, as though the night itself shifts, another world intrudes. Shadows lengthen into shapes, unicorns, dragons, beasts painted in tapestries. Symbols of animals that courts interpreted as signs of purity, passion, or sin. You step from the softness of whispered pillows into the strangeness of beastly symbols, where metaphors of horn, scale, and claw wrap themselves around the erotic imagination of princesses. The candle gutters out, and in its place the chamber glows with moonlight. Tapestries stir faintly in the draught, their woven beasts almost alive. A unicorn prances across one wall, its horn aimed skyward, while on another, a dragon coils in endless loops of crimson and gold thread. For medieval princesses, such creatures were not merely decorations, they were beastly symbols, saturated with meanings that hovered somewhere between sacred metaphor and scandalous innuendo. Contemporary chronicles reveal that unicorns in particular obsessed the medieval imagination. Bestiaries insisted a unicorn could be captured only by a virgin maiden who lured it to lay its head in her lap. Court poets twisted this image endlessly, turning princesses into living metaphors of purity, yet also slyly hinting at the erotic undertones of taming a wild beast. You can almost hear the nervous giggles behind fans when such verses were recited at banquets, each guest imagining the lap in question without daring to say it aloud. What's striking is how often these animals crept into daily ritual. A record from a Burgundian inventory lists a comb carved from unicorn horn, believed to protect against poison and infertility. Modern science would call it narwhal tusk, but in its time the object bristled with sexual symbolism. a phallic horn promising both protection and potency. To run such a comb through a princess's hair was to brush sanctity and innuendo together. Scholars quarrel over whether princesses themselves embraced these symbols playfully or were burdened by them. Some argue they laughed at the metaphors, rolling their eyes at endless unicorn analogies. Others suggest the imagery trapped them, forcing their identities into a single narrative of purity and fertility. The evidence remains divided, but either way, unicorns became mirrors reflecting the anxieties of their courts. Courtly tongues wagged about a Neapolitan princess who commissioned tapestries of dragons twined around roses. Courtiers speculated endlessly. Was she warning of lust, inviting it, or merely indulging in flamboyant design? A ribald rhyme circulated that roses with dragons bloom redder, hinting that her choice was hardly innocent. For a moment, it feels as though you are standing in front of those woven beasts yourself. The fabric is rough under your fingertips, the threads raised slightly like scars. The unicorn's stitched eyes seem too bright, its horn too deliberate, while the dragon's coils pulse like veins in the candlelight. These creatures blur into the atmosphere of the chamber, breathing metaphor into the princess's daily life. An unusual note appears in Florentine letters. A princess was gifted a goblet carved with tiny lions biting their own tails, a symbol of eternity. Yet the chronicler slyly added that she drank spiced wine from it, with such delight that eternity seemed very near. The line, half joke, half insinuation, reveals how even innocent animal motifs could become fodder for innuendo. Remarkably, animals also appeared in charms and amulets. A council record from Vienna mentions relic-like objects, wolf teeth to stir courage, or hare's foot for fertility, tucked discreetly into bridal trousseau. To modern eyes, they look like curiosities, but for princesses they were tactile symbols, pressed into palms or worn around necks as silent prayers for the body to perform its dynastic role. A mischievous chronicle from France reports that one princess was teased for keeping a small carved ivory unicorn in her bedchamber. Courtiers joked that the figurine was the only beast she allowed into her sheets. Whether cruel jest or affectionate ribbing, the story illustrates how beastly symbols never stayed safely metaphorical. They followed women into the most private spaces. The sensory atmosphere sharpens. You smell the dusty fibers of the tapestry. You hear the faint crack of wood as the loom creaks in memory. You feel the cool heft of an amulet shaped like a claw. Animals surrounded princesses not only in gardens or forests but in symbols crowding their chambers. Each creature carried a double load of purity and peril, desire and restraint. Researchers remain divided on whether these bestial motifs gave women symbolic tools of agency or functioned mainly as instruments of control. Did a unicorn tapestry allow a princess to mock expectations in secret, or did it constantly remind her of the role imposed upon her body? The argument is unresolved, but the tension itself captures how symbols both empower and trap. A curious detail emerges from Castilian poetry. Swans were depicted as both graceful lovers and tragic widows, their whiteness praised but their cries called erotic lamentations. One princess supposedly signed her letters with a swan doodle, and courtiers immediately speculated whether she hinted at secret longing. The poor bird became an accomplice to scandal it never asked for. For a moment, you feel the shadow of these creatures pressing close. The unicorn watches, the dragon coils tighter, the swan lifts its stitched wings. They are silent, but their meanings roar. A princess could never sit at her embroidery frame, sip from a goblet, or walk past a tapestry without beasts whispering their own commentaries on her virtue and desire. And just as the tapestries fade into dusk, the atmosphere shifts again. The smell of roses grows stronger, real this time, mingled with the damp earth of night gardens. You step outside into moonlit hedges where secrets rustle in the leaves, and where princesses, hungry for privacy, turned manicured landscapes into stages for clandestine rendezvous. The beastly symbols withdraw, and the garden knights beckon. The stitched beasts vanish into shadow, and suddenly the air grows damp, cool, and fragrant. You are no longer among tapestries but standing on dewy grass in the hush of a royal garden at night. Lanterns glow faintly along gravel paths, the hedges trimmed high like walls, the roses breathing out perfume into the darkness. This is the hidden stage of garden nights, where princesses, weary of watchful eyes, sometimes slipped into shadows to taste a secrecy the day denied them. Contemporary court records reveal how important gardens were to aristocratic households. They were not just for beauty but designed as controlled landscapes of power fountains placed with geometry, labyrinths cut to impress visitors, herb beds cultivated for medicine and scent. Yet when dusk fell and the gates locked, those same ordered spaces became sites of freedom. A garden was both sanctuary and trap, a perfect place to hide, yet also to be discovered. What's striking is how chronicles describe the garden at night with a mixture of piety and suspicion. Monks praised its order as a reflection of Eden, while satirists mocked it as a green theatre for courtly trysts. A letter from Burgundy calls it bluntly, "The hedges hear more secrets than the throne." You can almost hear the leaves rustle with whispers that were never meant for history's ear. An unusual note appears in Venetian archives. A princess was rumoured to meet her favoured knight by the fountain at midnight, a place chosen because the sound of water masked their voices. The story claims she dropped rose petals into the pool as a signal, each petal drifting toward him like a message. Whether truth or invention, the detail lingers, fragrant and reckless. Scholars quarrel over how often such garden encounters truly occurred. Some argue they were exaggerated by poets who loved to stage romance beneath moonlight. Others insist the sheer frequency of warnings from priests condemning the danger of gardens proves reality hid beneath the verses. Academic opinion splits. Was it myth woven from roses, or roses pressed against reality? Courtly tongues wagged about a French princess who kept a private key to the orchard gate. Gossip claimed she bribed the gardener to leave baskets of fruit where she could reach them at night, gifts meant for more than hunger. The tale may have been cruel invention, yet the image of her hand reaching through branches for figs and apples has stuck, sensual as well as suspicious. For a moment, it feels as though you are walking through those hedges yourself. The damp leaves brush against your sleeves, the gravel crunches softly underfoot, and the night air smells of mint, roses, and earth. Owls call in the distance, their notes low and questioning. You glance at the shadows between trees, half expecting to see cloaked figures moving with hushed laughter. What's peculiar is how many gardens contained labyrinths pathways meant to delight guests with playful confusion. But for a princess after dusk, a labyrinth offered more than amusement. A Florentine account describes lovers using winding paths as cover, meeting in the center where hedges blocked every view. To find one another in the maze was to enact desire itself, discovery hidden within confusion. A ribald anecdote from Aragon tells of a masquerade spilling outdoors, where veils slipped and masks dangled in the hedges. Courtiers later joked that roses were witnesses to indiscretions. The humour thinly veiled unease. Gardens, unlike chambers, had no tapestries or relics to sanctify behaviour. They were open, fragrant, and dangerous precisely because they carried no official script. Remarkably, gardens also held medicinal herbs tied to love and fertility. Rosemary, sage, and rue were planted alongside roses, giving the landscape a dual role, both apothecary and playground. Imagine a princess brushing past stalks of thyme while whispering to her confidant about marriage hopes, or plucking mint leaves to chew during a secret conversation. The plants themselves became accomplices, releasing fragrance with every touch. A curious footnote survives in English chronicles. One royal gardener was dismissed after being accused of arranging hedges too thickly, supposedly encouraging hidden sins. Whether the poor man was scapegoated or complicit, the story proves how closely people linked gardens with temptation. Even design itself became suspect. Every path read as an invitation. In your ears, you hear more than just owls and fountains. You catch the nervous laughter of women sneaking out barefoot, the swish of skirts brushing along wet grass, the hurried shush of companions. The garden, so carefully tended in daylight, transforms into a stage for improvisation at night. Researchers remain divided on whether princesses actively sought such moments or were forced into them by eager courtiers. Some accounts describe willing rendezvous, others hint at encounters half-coerced, hidden under the cover of foliage. The ambiguity lingers, as shadowy as the gardens themselves. For a moment, you press your hand against the cool bark of a tree. Its roughness grounds you, even as you imagine how easily hands might have touched here centuries ago, hesitant, daring, trembling. The memory of such touches would cling longer than the scent of roses, and yet history records them only as rumors, half believed. And then, as if the night air itself tightens, you notice something more deliberate. Ribbons tied discreetly to branches, sashes knotted around wrists, silk cords slipping through fingers. You realize the gardens sometimes hosted not only whispers but games of binding, where fashion turned into a tool of restraint. The path ahead leads you out of roses and into silk, into the strangeness of silken bonds and the whispers they left behind. The fragrance of roses lingers, but as you follow the path through moonlit hedges, you notice something different, a shimmer of fabric tied loosely to a branch. Silk, pale as moonlight, sways in the breeze. Another ribbon lies on the ground, damp with dew. You stoop to touch it, and it slides between your fingers like water. This is not decoration. These are traces of silken bonds, whispers of play and scandal disguised as fashion, where cords and sashes served more than ornamental purposes. Contemporary accounts reveal that ribbons, girdles, and sashes were constant features of courtly attire. Princesses wore gowns bound with long laces that trailed elegantly, or girdles that cinched waists with jeweled clasps. To the watching world, they were signs of wealth. But behind closed doors, these same items became props in games of restraint, sometimes innocent, sometimes suggestive. What's striking is how the language of court poetry leaned into this imagery. A troubadour verse from Provence describes a lady tying her lover's hands with the ribbon that bound her sleeve, framing it as proof of loyalty. Whether the act was literal or metaphorical, listeners understood the double meaning. Bonds made of silk were soft enough to avoid injury, yet strong enough to symbolize control. Archival notes from Florence even mention garments designed with play cords, decorative ties that could be undone or repurposed in moments of intimacy. To imagine a princess slipping one loose, watching it coil like a serpent into her hand, is to sense how easily fashion blurred into private amusement. Scholars quarrel over whether these practices were widespread or exaggerated in rumor. Some argue silken bonds were symbolic gestures, tokens exchanged during courtship rituals rather than enacted in secret chambers. Others insist enough suggestive poetry and sly anecdotes survive to hint at real experimentation. The evidence remains contested, caught between literary flourish and lived experience. Courtly tongues wagged over a French princess who allegedly tied her suitor's ring onto a ribbon around her thigh, declaring that "what binds me binds him." The gesture was provocative enough to inspire bawdy songs, and though her family denied it, the image lingered silk as both ornament and chain. For a moment, it feels as though you are in the chamber yourself. The curtains are drawn, the candlelight soft. You hear the faint whisper of silk slipping free, the hushed laughter of attendants folding ribbons, the sharp intake of breath when fabric brushes bare skin. The touch is feather-light, yet the symbolism heavy. Restraint offered not through iron but through softness. An unusual note surfaces in Neapolitan inventories. A princess's trousseau included 12 girdles of silk for diverse uses. The phrase raised eyebrows even then. Diverse uses could mean ceremonial display, or it could mean private improvisation, a detail juicy enough for rumor to seize. You can almost picture courtiers exchanging knowing glances while the list was read aloud. Remarkably, silk itself carried connotations beyond touch. Imported from the East, its sheen and expense lent it a sense of mystery. To bind with silk was to bind with luxury, making the gesture both intimate and political. A council decree from Milan confirms this. Laws forbade servants from owning silken cords, ensuring the material remained a privilege of the elite. The implication was clear: only nobles could play with such softness. A ribald anecdote from Burgundy recalls a masquerade where guests tied one another's wrists with sashes as part of a game. Most participants laughed, treating it as harmless amusement, but whispers followed one princess who seemed to enjoy the gesture too much. Her name became linked with knots for years afterward, though no one ever dared accuse her directly. The sensory weight of silk lingers. You feel its cool slide against your palm, its almost slippery resistance. It smells faintly of the dyes that colored it: indigo, saffron, madder, each shade carrying a story. To wrap such fabric around someone was to weave threads of desire and secrecy together, a silent pact with no witnesses but the cloth itself. Researchers remain divided on whether women themselves initiated these silken games, or whether they were inventions of courtiers eager to scandalize. Some evidence suggests princesses gifted ribbons as tokens, knowing well the erotic whispers attached. Others imply the symbolism was imposed on them, their every accessory turned into rumor. Perhaps the truth lay in both: silk as tool of agency, silk as weapon of gossip. A curious detail from English correspondence tells of a princess who sent her knight a ribbon she had worn in her hair, knotted 3 times. He boasted of the gift openly, and soon satirical poems circulated that the knots meant more than loyalty. You can almost hear the suppressed laughter of courtiers repeating the lines, each imagining what the knots concealed. For a moment, the garden fades, and you are left holding a strip of silk in the darkness. It slips easily through your hand, impossible to grasp fully, just as the truth of these bonds eludes certainty. But one thing is clear: ribbons, cords, and sashes carried meanings heavier than their weight. They tethered women to both rumor and desire, binding them softly yet unforgettably. And just as the last ribbon drops into the grass, the scene shifts again. The air smells of dust and travel, the tramp of pilgrims' boots echoing on stone. You realize the next stage of this strange journey carries you beyond gardens and chambers, into roads and shrines, pilgrimage ruses, where piety disguised escape, and religious journeys doubled as secret trysts. The dew-wet ribbons slip from your hand, and now the air changes again, drier, full of dust and distant bells. You hear the murmur of chanting pilgrims, the creak of leather boots on stony paths, and the faint scent of wax and sweat mixed with wild herbs. You are no longer in the palace garden but on the open road. This is the strange world of pilgrimage ruses, when medieval princesses cloaked escape and desire beneath the holy banner of travel to shrines. Household records reveal that noblewomen often requested leave to journey to sacred sites, citing illness, vows, or dreams that demanded fulfillment. To visit the shrine of a saint was considered pious, beyond reproach. Yet for princesses weary of constant watch, pilgrimage offered something more. It provided distance from court, and with distance came opportunities. What's striking is how quickly gossip attached itself to these journeys. A Burgundian chronicle notes that one princess's pilgrimage to Santiago was whispered to be more for freedom than for relics. Along the route, inns and chapels provided spaces less guarded than palace halls. A veiled woman could slip into anonymity, her footsteps hidden among dozens of other pilgrims. An unusual note appears in Venetian correspondence. A princess allegedly disguised herself in plain woolen dress to join a procession, walking unrecognized for miles before reuniting with her retinue. Courtiers alternated between amusement and horror. To them, it was reckless folly. To her, perhaps, it was the closest taste of ordinary life she would ever know. Scholars quarrel over how deliberate these ruses were. Some argue princesses carefully staged them as escapes for clandestine meetings with favored companions. Others claim the stories were later embellishments, spun by satirists eager to tarnish reputations. Academic opinion remains split, but the pattern of rumor itself proves how plausible such escapes seemed. Courtly tongues wagged most about an Aragonese princess who insisted on travelling to a distant shrine with only a handful of attendants. Along the way, she was said to have spent unusually long evenings at roadside chapels, her prayers suspiciously timed with the visits of a particular night. The gossip outlasted her marriage, retold as both scandal and legend. For a moment it feels as though you are walking beside her on the dusty road. The ground is uneven underfoot, the air filled with the bray of donkeys, the chatter of fellow travellers. Your cloak smells of sweat and rosemary sprigs tucked in for protection. By day, it is a march of faith. By night, when shadows lengthen, it becomes something else entirely, a theatre of secrecy masked by piety. Remarkably, even the shrines themselves sometimes played roles in this double life. A council decree from Cologne notes complaints that noble visitors tarried too long in side chapels, disrupting liturgies. The vague phrasing hides suspicion. Were the noblewomen truly praying, or stealing moments of privacy impossible at home? The walls of holy places absorbed both incense smoke and whispered laughter. A ribald anecdote from Burgundy insists that a princess once returned from a pilgrimage carrying not only relics but a child conceived along the way. Chroniclers recorded it as satire, but the sting of the joke lingers. Pilgrimage became a euphemism for indiscretion, and every absence was suspect. You can almost hear the cynical chuckles of courtiers as they repeated the tale. A curious detail comes from English letters. Some princesses carried small travel reliquaries, portable shrines strapped to their belts. They were meant as protection, but in practice they became excuses for solitude. To claim one needed time for prayer by a roadside cross was to carve out minutes, sometimes hours, free from supervision. Whether used for devotion or diversion, the reliquary itself shielded whatever happened in its shadow. In your ears, the sounds of the road mingle with low murmurs. Pilgrims singing hymns, horses snorting, distant bells marking the hours. Yet beneath the piety is another rhythm, the quickened heartbeat of someone using the journey as cover. The road itself becomes accomplice, each mile a buffer between duty and freedom. Researchers remain divided on whether these pilgrimages genuinely offered princesses freedom or whether they were illusions, still tightly bound by attendants and watchful clergy. Some emphasize the courage of women who seized even small cracks in surveillance. Others insist the risks outweighed the chances, that most tales of trysts on pilgrimages were malicious inventions. The uncertainty only deepens the fascination. For a moment, you picture the arrival at a shrine. Incense thick in the air, candles flickering, relics glinting in jeweled cases. A princess kneels, her veil pulled low, lips moving in silent prayer. To outsiders, she is holy, devoted. To herself, perhaps, she is savoring the freedom of anonymity, the knowledge that even if nothing scandalous occurs, the possibility was hers for a night. And then, as if to remind you that secrecy always teeters on exposure, the imagery shifts. The shrine grows dim, the candles burn lower, and you notice shadows dancing against the wall. In the next chamber, intimacy will not be hidden in cloisters or roads, but revealed in silhouettes. Candle shadows, playful and unsettling, form the next stage of this tale, games of light and imagination where bodies flickered across walls, as if theatre itself were performed by flame. The dust of the pilgrimage road fades, and now the air warms again, with the thick scent of beeswax candles. You are back inside a chamber, but this one is darker, more private, lit only by flames flickering on tall iron stands. Shadows sway across stone walls, stretching and collapsing like living figures. The atmosphere is heavy with wax smoke and the faint sweetness of resin incense. Here, the princess and her companions indulge in candle shadows, games of silhouettes and imagined bodies, where desire hid in plain sight. Contemporary letters from Burgundian courts reveal that princesses were often entertained by shadow play. Servants held up their hands against candlelight to form birds, animals, or comic figures. But in private, the games turned more daring. Hands and veils shaped curves, gestures mimicked embraces, and walls became canvases for fantasies too risky to enact in daylight. A small flick of the wrist transformed propriety into scandalous suggestion. What's striking is how much symbolism flickered in those shadows. One German chronicler describes how a princess laughed as her maid cast the silhouette of a swan upon the wall. To outsiders, a bird was innocent. But swans, associated with passion and longing, carried undertones the princess surely understood. A bird became a body, a wing became an embrace. Archival notes from Florence mention that tapestries were sometimes deliberately pulled aside to create blank walls for shadow play. In one account, courtiers were scandalized to discover a group of ladies in waiting, projecting figures of men and women in intimate poses. Though dismissed as childish mischief, the record reveals how even harmless amusement could blur into forbidden imagination. Scholars quarrel over whether these candle games were trivial entertainments or coded rehearsals for intimacy. Some argue the silhouettes offered a safe outlet, allowing princesses to laugh at scandal without committing it. Others insist the practice was far from innocent, a sly performance that carried its own risks of rumor. The evidence remains tangled, the shadows themselves refusing to settle into clarity. Courtly tongues wagged about a French princess who supposedly asked her chambermaids to project the outline of her fiancé using nothing but veils and ribbons. When the figure on the wall looked more robust than the man himself, she burst into laughter, declaring the shadow was better husband than reality. The jest spread quickly, delighting courtiers but humiliating the groom. Shadows became sharper than words. For a moment, it feels as though you are in the chamber too. The wax smoke prickles your nose, the candles hiss softly, and the shadows slide across the walls like silent performers. The laughter is hushed, conspiratorial. You realize how thrilling it must have been for a princess to see forbidden gestures acted out by nothing more than darkness and light, plausible deniability, hovering in every flicker. A curious note surfaces in Castilian manuscripts. During long winter nights, nobles carved small wooden figures to cast elaborate silhouettes. Some depicted saints, others more risque images of lovers entwined. When pressed against candlelight, they came alive, looming larger than life across plastered walls. The line between devotion and desire was blurred by nothing more than flame and imagination. Remarkably, the church itself occasionally tolerated shadow play. A council decree from Cologne warns against obscene silhouettes in noble households, but permits shadow images of saints for teaching children. The hypocrisy is clear. The practice was acceptable if used for piety, dangerous if used for pleasure. Yet the same flickering flame could create either. A ribald anecdote from Venice recounts that during one feast, a group of ladies projected the silhouette of a kissing couple onto the wall behind a bishop. The cleric, oblivious, continued blessing the gathering, while the audience stifled laughter. The story spread like wildfire, turning candle games into satire of both piety and propriety. The sensory world deepens. You feel the warmth of the candle flame too close to your skin, the oily residue on your fingertips after trimming the wick, the faint draft that makes the shadows dance. To live in such a chamber was to live with constant reminders that light itself could be playful, even scandalous. Researchers remain divided on whether princesses used these games for genuine exploration of desire or whether they were framed later as scandal by gossip mongers. Some suggest women found empowerment in controlling what appeared on the wall, shaping images beyond men's reach. Others caution that the very rumors of obscenity show how easily amusement could be turned into weapon against them. For a moment, you close your eyes and hear only the soft laughter of young women playing in the dark, their shadows stretching tall and monstrous one moment, delicate and shy the next. The intimacy lies not only in the images but in the shared complicity, the knowledge that walls, silent witnesses, now carried imprints of their secret play. And then, just as the candles burn low, another figure enters the chamber, not a maid with ribbons but a physician, carrying jars of herbs and scrolls of remedies. His presence shifts the atmosphere from play to prescription. Soon, the body itself will be treated as a case study, with intimacy recast as therapy. The candle shadows fade into the clinical light of the next chapter, the mask of healing, where physicians prescribed closeness as cure. The candlelight dwindles, the laughter fades, and into the dim chamber steps a man in darker robes, his belt heavy with pouches of herbs and instruments. He smells of rosemary and vinegar, the sharp tang of ointments clinging to his sleeves. His voice is lower than the playful giggles of maids, deliberate and grave. You are in the company of a physician now, and the atmosphere has shifted into something stranger, the mask of healing, when intimacy was not only permitted but prescribed as medicine. Contemporary medical texts reveal how often women's bodies were interpreted through the lens of humoral theory, the balance of hot, cold, wet, and dry. Physicians argued that female flesh, being naturally moist, risked stagnation if not properly exercised. For princesses, this theory became a double-edged blade, chastity praised by priests, yet physical union sometimes recommended by doctors to maintain health. Imagine the confusion of being told purity made you holy, but intimacy made you whole. What's striking is how blunt some remedies sound to modern ears. A Latin manuscript from Montpellier insists that melancholia of women may be cured by the act of Venus, lest humours corrupt within. Cloaked in scholarly language, it was essentially a prescription for sex. To a princess raised in piety, such advice could feel both scandalous and authoritative. How do you argue with medicine when your body is treated like a vessel for the state's future heirs? An unusual note appears in French court correspondence. One physician suggested that a young royal bride's fainting fits would vanish if she took her husband more earnestly. The phrase, vague yet charged, caused murmurs among attendants. Was it diagnosis, encouragement, or intrusion? Either way, the line was repeated with raised eyebrows long after the girl recovered. Academic opinion splits sharply on whether these prescriptions were genuine attempts at health or veiled justifications for male desire. Some scholars argue physicians sincerely believed in humoral theory, thinking passion essential to female well-being. Others counter that such advice blurred dangerously into coercion, granting medical authority to demands of husbands or rulers. The ambiguity remains unresolved and unsettling. Courtly tongues wagged about a Neapolitan princess whose physician prescribed nightly baths with her husband, claiming the warm water and closeness would balance the humours. Whether or not the treatment worked, gossip turned it into a bawdy joke retold at feasts. What began as a medical recommendation became a scandal etched into her reputation. For a moment, it feels as though you are in the room during such a consultation. The table is cluttered with jars of honey, vials of herbs, small knives glinting in candlelight. You smell the pungent mix of mint and vinegar as poultices are prepared. The physician leans in, his tone patronizing yet strangely intimate, prescribing remedies that trespass into private chambers. Remarkably, even infertility was treated through intimacy framed as therapy. A council decree from Siena confirms that doctors were summoned to supervise, or at least advise couples on proper consummation when heirs failed to appear. Imagine the humiliation of having your marriage bed turned into a case file, your most personal moments dissected under the guise of science. A ribald anecdote from Burgundy describes a physician who supposedly recommended that a princess wear a mask soaked in musk while lying with her husband, the scent thought to rouse her spirits. Courtiers laughed, calling it medicine for the nose more than the womb. Yet the story endured, an absurd reminder of how remedies veered between superstition and sensuality. A curious detail surfaces in English accounts. Medical guides sometimes advised women to read romantic poetry aloud as a kind of therapy. The rhythm of verse, combined with imagination, was believed to warm the blood. To picture a princess reciting troubadour songs under doctor's orders feels both comic and tragic desire, transformed into prescription, longing given the disguise of medicine. In your ears, you hear the rustle of parchment as remedies are recorded, the clink of mortar and pestle grinding herbs, the low murmur of physicians debating symptoms. The chamber, once a place of perfume or prayer, now resembles a clinic, though its treatments blur into rituals of intimacy. The line between healing and scandal is so thin you can almost hear it snap. Researchers remain divided on whether princesses welcomed such interventions or endured them with resentment. Some evidence suggests women strategically invoked medical advice to claim respite from expectations, saying, "The physician forbids." Others may have felt stripped of agency, their bodies discussed like livestock. The contradiction itself embodies the strangeness of medieval medicine. Authority claimed in both healing and harm. For a moment, you imagine pressing a linen cloth soaked in herbs against your face. It smells of sage and musk, damp and heavy. The physician nods approvingly, declaring it good for the womb. You realize how absurd and yet how real such moments must have been, as women lay still beneath remedies that blurred into theatre. And as the jars are packed away, the physician bows and exits, leaving silence behind. The candle burns lower, and in that dimness, another kind of writing appears. Not prescriptions this time, but letters hidden in books, verses folded into margins. You sense the chamber filling with words, secret poems, and coded scripture. The next scene awaits, letters in cipher, where pious texts concealed the most private desires of all. The smell of herbs fades with the physician's departure, leaving the chamber quieter, darker, and strangely expectant. On the table lies a psalter, its pages worn from years of turning. A candle drips beside it, casting just enough light to reveal neat black letters on the vellum and something else, written smaller, slanting in the margins. This is the secret world of letters in cipher, where devotional books became hiding places for verses too dangerous to write openly, and where a princess could turn scripture into camouflage for desire. Contemporary inventories of royal libraries show how often women owned prayer books, breviaries, or psalters bound in velvet and studded with jewels. They were carried daily, kissed at mass, read before sleep. But inside those covers, tiny notes sometimes hid. A line of poetry slipped into a blank page, a phrase in code inked faintly between psalms. To anyone glancing, it was holy text. To one who knew, it was a love letter hidden in plain sight. What's striking is how easily letters could disguise themselves as piety. A Castilian manuscript preserves marginal doodles of vines and flowers, but scholars discovered that the first letter of each vine's curve spelled out a name. To most eyes, they were innocent flourishes. To the intended reader, they were a declaration of longing. Imagine running your fingers over the page, tracing prayer and passion in the same breath. Archival notes from Florence describe a cipher system, where vowels were replaced by symbols of crosses or stars. Such codes allowed lines of poetry to be written without attracting suspicion. The text looked like decoration. In truth, it concealed verses far less holy. One princess supposedly copied a psalm by hand, then embedded a poem to her knight within the spacing of its lines. A hymn became a palimpsest of devotion to both God and man. Scholars quarrel over how widespread these practices were. Some argue that only a handful of daring women engaged in cipher writing, aided by tutors or confidants. Others insist that the frequency of coded marginalia suggests it was more common than we imagine. The debate remains unresolved, but the fact that so many ciphers survive in scraps suggests a hunger to write what could not be spoken. Courtly tongues wagged about a French princess whose confessor discovered folded slips of parchment hidden in her psalter. Each bore a stanza of love poetry, carefully encrypted. The priest denounced it as sin, but others whispered admiration she had found a way to make the holiest object her shield. The story circulated in ballads, turning her into a figure both scandalous and ingenious. For a moment it feels as though you are holding one of those books yourself. The vellum is smooth beneath your fingertips, the ink faintly raised, the smell of calfskin lingering. You tilt the page, and in the margins faint symbols glimmer. Your eyes adjust, and suddenly the text is no longer only sacred but intimate. The thrill lies in the double reading, one line for the public, another for the heart. A curious detail appears in Neapolitan letters. Courtiers mentioned the exchange of psalters between betrothed couples as gifts. One such book, preserved today, contains faint erased lines of a troubadour song written diagonally across scripture. Erasures still visible under light prove that someone, perhaps a nervous princess, attempted to hide passion once it grew too dangerous. The ghost of the words lingers, as though vellum itself remembers. Remarkably, even embroidery sometimes carried these codes alongside letters. A Venetian princess is said to have stitched a verse into her girdle lining, visible only to one who untied it. Letters in thread, letters in ink, letters in whispered syllables, all methods of saying what the world forbade. A ribald anecdote from Burgundy describes a lady in waiting teasing her mistress. "Your psalter prays louder than your lips." The jest circulated widely, reinforcing the suspicion that holy books in noblewomen's hands were not always as innocent as they appeared. The laughter in that joke carries centuries, mocking yet admiring the boldness of such concealment. The sensory weight of this practice deepens. You smell the candle wax dripping onto parchment, feel the scratch of quill against vellum, hear the faint rustle of pages as they turn. Each sense reminds you that writing was a physical act, ink staining fingers, words seeping into skin as much as soul. To slip a ciphered letter into a prayer book was to risk discovery with every turn of the page. Researchers remain divided on whether these letters represented rebellion or resignation. Some see them as brave acts of agency, carving out space for female voices in a world of silence. Others stress that secrecy itself shows constraint, women forced to hide their own words in sacred covers. Perhaps both are true, each cipher a thread of defiance stitched into the fabric of obedience. For a moment, the candle sputters, and you imagine the fear of being caught that instant when the priest or husband might notice faint symbols glinting in the margin. Yet just as quickly, you sense the exhilaration, the knowledge that the book in your hands holds both psalms and sighs, both the voice of God and the whisper of longing. And as the candle burns lower, the psalter closes, heavy and jeweled. The chamber grows darker, yet voices stir beyond its door, not hidden in margins this time, but declared openly in ritual public bedding ceremonies, where privacy was denied and witnesses demanded. You are carried now toward that unsettling spectacle, where desire itself was staged as theatre before the eyes of the court. The jeweled psalter snaps shut, and the hush of secret letters gives way to a roar of noise trumpets blaring, guests shouting, the shuffle of 100 feet on stone floors. You smell roasted meat and spiced wine drifting through the air, but there is another scent too, wax from torches burning in every corridor, smoke clinging to velvet curtains. The scene has shifted again, into one of the most unsettling spectacles a princess might endure: public bedding ceremonies, staged rituals where privacy was sacrificed to prove marriage complete. Court records confirm these ceremonies were not rare. Across France, England, and the German states, it was common for nobles to escort a newlywed couple into the chamber, strip them to their undergarments, and lay them in bed while prayers were said. To outsiders, this guaranteed legitimacy of heirs. To the couple, and especially to a princess, it was theatre performed under the cruel gaze of peers and clergy. What's striking is how formalized the humiliation became. A Scottish chronicle describes torchbearers surrounding the bed, their flames casting long shadows as attendants removed boots, cloaks, and jewelry from the bride and groom. A bishop muttered blessings while courtiers cheered. The moment of intimacy that should have belonged to two people instead became a pageant with witnesses craning for every detail. An unusual note appears in Aragonese accounts. Sometimes the couple was given hot spiced wine to drink before being left alone, as though fortifying courage for what must follow. In at least one record, the bride refused to drink, claiming it was too strong. Gossips quickly declared her unwillingness, a sign of coldness, a judgment that haunted her name for years. Academic opinion splits sharply over how literally these rituals were carried out. Some historians argue most bedding ceremonies ended with attendants leaving before consummation, the witnesses satisfied by ritual gestures. Others maintain that in certain courts, the pressure to prove fertility was so strong that consummation was indeed spied upon. No agreement has been reached, leaving the truth dangling uncomfortably between rumor and law. Courtly tongues wagged most about a French princess whose bedding was described in a satirical poem. According to the verses, her groom fumbled nervously, while older courtiers joked aloud. The poem mocked both their innocence and the cruelty of forcing such moments into public theatre. Whether the details were exaggerated or not, the ridicule followed her for life. For a moment, it feels as though you are in that chamber yourself. The air is stifling with heat from too many torches. The sheets smell of fresh linen but also of sweat from the crowd pressing close. You hear laughter, whispers, the creak of floorboards as nobles jostle for a better view. Then silence, when the couple is pushed gently, sometimes not so gently, into bed. The door closes, and you are left to imagine the rest. A curious detail from English household accounts mentions that the bedding sheets were inspected the next morning by matrons, who claimed to know by sight whether consummation had taken place. This practice, far from private, reduced intimacy to evidence, passion to linen. The sheets themselves became testimony, blurring the line between love and politics. Remarkably, in some regions these ceremonies included symbolic props. A council decree from Brabant notes the custom of throwing shoes at the bed, a gesture of fertility. In other cases, guests tossed nuts or fruit, echoing ancient pagan traditions. The blending of Christian prayers with fertility superstitions only added to the surreal nature of the event. A ribald anecdote from Burgundy tells of a bedding night when a mischievous courtier slipped a live rooster under the sheets, its flapping interpreted as a sign of vigor. The prank spread as scandalous song, mocking both the groom and the poor bride caught in the chaos. To imagine such humiliation makes your skin prickle, as though you too are under those sheets with laughter ringing in your ears. In your senses, the moment is oppressive. You feel the rough linen scratching against your arms, the weight of too many eyes, the heavy air saturated with wine, breath, and smoke. What should have been a private embrace feels instead like performance bodies transformed into evidence, love reduced to politics. Researchers remain divided on whether princesses endured these ceremonies with silent resignation or found ways to reclaim small victories. Some suggest women cleverly delayed, stalling the crowd until only gestures remained. Others believe resistance was futile, that the pageant of bedding marked the ultimate surrender of autonomy. Both views capture the haunting tension of ritualized exposure. For a moment, you close your eyes and imagine the silence after the torches leave, the door finally barred. The couple lies side by side, flushed with embarrassment, perhaps whispering nervously. The echo of the crowd lingers in their ears. Even in privacy, the memory of being watched hovers like a shadow over the bed. And just as your mind settles into that uneasy chamber, the scene shifts again. The bed dissolves, the torchlight fades, and you are carried into the rhythms of music, the thrum of drums, the haunting cry of lutes. Now intimacy will not be inspected but performed in dance, secret choreographies, where steps themselves carried coded desire. The echo of laughter and torch smoke drifts away, and in its place comes rhythm soft at first, like the patter of bare feet on stone, then rising into the pulse of drums. You smell resin incense again, mingling with the sharper tang of sweat, and you feel the vibration of lutes and fiddles thrumming through the floor. This is no bedding chamber now, but a hall alive with music, where princesses turn dance into secret language. Household accounts reveal that noble courts across Europe hosted elaborate masquerades and feast day dances, occasions where movement itself could express what words could not. For a princess constantly watched, the act of swaying, twirling, or bowing became a rare chance to send signals in plain sight. A glance held longer than etiquette allowed, a hand lingering half a beat, these gestures formed a language as intricate as any ciphered letter. What's striking is how codified these movements could be. In Burgundian manuals of courtly dance, steps were given symbolic meanings. A sudden pause might suggest refusal, a backward glide modesty, a leap forward daring. When a princess danced, she wasn't only moving to music, she was speaking a language that only the keenest eyes could read. A curious note appears in Italian chronicles. One princess allegedly altered a single step in a widely known dance, replacing a polite turn with a deeper bend of the waist. To most, it seemed like flourish. But to her partner, it was unmistakable invitation. Courtiers later debated whether the move had been mistake or mischief, but the rumor of its meaning clung for years. Academic opinion remains split over whether these choreographies truly conveyed passion, or whether later commentators romanticized harmless movements. Some researchers insist the symbolic codes were real, used as discreet expressions of love. Others counter that most dance was merely entertainment, with scandal only added afterward by gossip. No consensus exists, and perhaps that ambiguity itself made dance so tantalizing. It was impossible to prove what a step truly meant. Courtly tongues wagged about a princess in Aragon, whose habit was to drop her glove during a circle dance. Always the same knight stooped to retrieve it, and always she thanked him with a smile, a shade too warm. Whether it was accident or prearranged game, the glove drop became court legend, mocked in poems and imitated by others until even her enemies used it as symbol of her daring. For a moment, it feels as though you are there on the polished floor, the music humming in your ears, the flicker of torches throwing gleam across jeweled gowns. You catch the sweep of skirts brushing your calves, the faint perfume of roses and cinnamon drifting as dancers spin past. Then, the subtle press of a hand in yours brief, proper to everyone else, yet charged with secret meaning only you and the other understand. Remarkably, even religious processions blurred into these coded movements. A council decree from Paris warns against improper turns during festival dances, hinting that women used spins and bows to flash glimpses of ankle or wrist. To the clergy, this was indecency. To participants, it was the thrill of hidden play inside sanctioned celebration. One mischievous anecdote from Castile insists that a princess once instructed her lute player to slow the rhythm, stretching a dance until her father grew impatient. The delay gave her more time with her chosen partner, though it also earned her a scolding. Still, the story spread in laughter, remembered less as defiance than as charm. An unusual detail surfaces from Hungarian letters. Some princesses embroidered secret symbols into their dance slippers, tiny hearts or initials visible only to those close enough to see the sole when they twirled. Imagine the daring of stamping a hidden name across the floor, while dozens of courtiers applauded, none realizing what was underfoot. The sensory weight of these moments grows vivid. You hear the pluck of lute strings sharp against the drone of bagpipes. You feel the sudden heat of a crowded hall, the brush of silks against your wrist, the thud of heels marking rhythm. Each sound and touch carries its own double meaning. Every step a gamble between propriety and exposure. Researchers remain divided on whether dance offered real freedom or only the illusion of it. Some believe the coded movements allowed women to express desire without words, carving out fleeting autonomy. Others argue the codes themselves were fragile, easily misinterpreted or mocked, leaving princesses more vulnerable than empowered. Both interpretations linger, as inseparable as partners locked in step. For a moment, you close your eyes and let the rhythm carry you. Your body moves forward, back, spin, pause each gesture, whispering what cannot be said aloud. It is exhilarating, dangerous, ephemeral. Then the music ends, and applause erupts, breaking the spell. And as silence settles, the hall transforms. The dancers vanish, the lutes fall quiet, and you are left with the echo of footsteps alone. Not in a ballroom this time, but on the stone floor of a cloister. The air is colder here, sharper with the scent of chalk and parchment. Soon, the stage will shift once again to education cloisters, where princesses learned not only prayers but secret lessons whispered in the shadow of monastic walls. The last note of music dies, and the swirl of silks collapses into silence. Now you hear only the hollow tap of sandals on flagstone, the muffled chant of monks echoing from afar. The air is cool and dry, thick with the chalky dust of stone cloisters. Beeswax smoke lingers faintly, mingling with the sharper tang of ink and parchment. You find yourself within an education cloister, where princesses were often sent to learn prayers, languages, and needlework, and, in some corners, things far less official. Court registers leave no doubt that monasteries and convents took responsibility for educating noble daughters in Latin, scripture, and courtly manners. These walls were meant to be austere, a fortress of piety against worldly temptation. Yet the very seclusion that kept men out also created spaces where forbidden stories, whispers, and experiments could take root unseen. What's striking is how many chronicles hint at double lessons. A princess might copy psalms in neat hand during the day, then scrawl verses of troubadour songs in the margins at night. A tutor might drill her on Latin declensions, while slipping wry asides about Ovid's Ars Amatoria. Behind the guise of grammar, young women discovered the language of desire dressed as literature. A curious footnote survives in a Flemish manuscript where two different inks reveal alternating lessons, scripture in black, but in brown, faintly overlaid, short dialogues of lovers. Scholars suspect the notes were exercises in translation, yet the very choice of text suggests a hunger for material more tantalizing than psalms alone. Researchers remain divided on whether such writings were sanctioned by sympathetic tutors or smuggled secretly between pupils. Some argue that female networks within cloisters provided safety for coded exploration, while others believe isolated examples are exaggerated by scandal-hungry chroniclers. The truth, as often, flickers somewhere between repression and revelation. Courtly tongues wagged about a Bohemian princess rumored to have learned the 7 kisses from an older nun. Whether the story was invention or confession, it circulated widely, painting cloisters not as austere but as curious theatres of education, where innocence mixed with experimentation. The anecdote, more whispered than written, became part of her legend long after she left the convent. For a moment, it feels as though you are walking in that cloister yourself. The stone walls radiate coolness under your fingertips, the echo of sandals rings in your ears, and the faint waxy scent of candles mixes with lavender sprigs tucked into novices' belts. In a quiet corner, a princess bends over parchment, her quill scratching slowly. You look closer. Is she copying a psalm or sketching a heart hidden in the swirl of letters? Remarkably, some lessons blended ritual and play. A council decree from Cologne scolds abbesses for allowing dances unbecoming of cloistered women during feast days. The text suggests that music, perhaps smuggled in by travelling clerks, provided rhythm for games that blurred prayer with passion. Even in places meant for devotion, the body still found ways to move. One mischievous anecdote from Italy describes how young noble girls braided each other's hair into shapes of hearts during study hours, giggling as stern tutors pretended not to notice. Hair itself, long and fragrant with oils, became a medium for expression. To wear a braid in a certain twist was to declare hidden sympathies, a code woven strand by strand. An unusual note appears in the correspondence of a tutor at Prague's courtly convent. She complains of students practicing secret letters during embroidery lessons, hiding words in knots of thread. The very act of stitching devotion onto altar cloths became a chance to encode private phrases, the sacred cloth carrying both piety and subversion in its fibres. The sensory world is sharp here. You hear the clatter of inkwells set down too quickly, the squeak of quills across parchment. You smell chalk scraped onto slates, lavender rubbed into hands to chase away ink stains. You feel the rough wool of habits brushing against your arms, the cool hardness of benches. The cloister is meant to discipline, but in its silence, desire carves small cracks. Academic debate rages still. Were these cloistered educations truly repressive, enforcing chastity above all else? Or did they inadvertently cultivate intellectual and emotional curiosity that turned toward the forbidden? Some scholars insist that walls cannot kill imagination. Others argue that confinement intensified the very practices it sought to control. Neither side yields, and the cloisters echo with their disagreement centuries later. For a moment, you close your eyes and hear faint humming one girl daring to sing a lyric from a troubadour ballad under her breath. The notes curl like smoke into the cloister air, fragile but persistent. A princess joins softly, their voices mingling, half prayer, half poem. It is not loud, not defiant, but enough to hint that within even the strictest walls, hearts found ways to speak. And as the humming fades, another sound rises, the murmur of feasts and the rattle of dice. The cloister dissolves into the glow of banquets, where goblets clink and the smell of roasted boar fills the air. Soon, you will enter those lavish halls, where strange feasting customs offered another stage for intimacy disguised as celebration. The quiet cloister vanishes, its lavender and chalk replaced by the roar of a great hall alive with firelight. The air is thick with the smell of roasted boar, venison spiced with cloves, and honeyed wine spilling from goblets. Candles smoke above the tables, dripping wax onto oak boards polished by years of feasting. The echo of chanting monks is gone, replaced by the clash of goblets and the slap of hands on wood. Here you find yourself in the theatre of feasts, where food itself carried bizarre meanings for a princess. Household accounts from Burgundy confirm that banquets could stretch late into the night, with dozens of dishes served in ritual sequence. To the average guest, these were displays of wealth. To a princess, they often became coded spectacles. What she ate, what she refused, even what she touched might be read as a declaration. A peach tasted too slowly, a fig passed hand to hand, a goblet drained in a single breath. All of it could mean more than polite hunger. What's striking is how many foods were charged with erotic symbolism. Almonds and pomegranates represented fertility. Figs, shaped like certain body parts, were laughed about even in scripture commentaries. When a princess reached for such fruits, she risked her gesture being interpreted not as appetite but as innuendo, and sometimes it was intentional. Chronicles describe royal daughters lingering over sugared pears, savouring them in a way that drew smirks from courtiers watching. A curious footnote from Neapolitan records mentions a dish of roasted doves stuffed with saffron rice, served at a wedding banquet. The chronicler slyly remarks that the bride lingered over the dish, as if she sought the strength within. Was it coincidence, or did the symbolism of doves long tied to Venus deliberately colour the moment? Scholars argue still, unable to separate appetite from allegory. Courtly tongues wagged endlessly about a Polish princess known for drinking her wine, not in sips but in long draughts. To her peers, this boldness blurred lines between feasting and flirting. One poet turned it into satire, writing that her lips thirsted more for the goblet than for prayer. The reputation stuck, whether fair or not. For a moment, it feels as though you sit at her table. The cup is heavy in your hand, cool silver slicked with condensation. The spiced wine warms your lips, sharp with cinnamon and nutmeg, as laughter bursts down the hall. The princess across from you bites into a fig, juice sliding down her fingers, and the entire table goes quiet for a beat. Then the room erupts again, louder than before, pretending it noticed nothing. An unusual note appears in German accounts. It was custom in some courts for a new bride to share her first bite with her groom before the feast could continue. A morsel touched by her lips passed to him symbolized not just unity, but submission. Whether such rituals felt sweet or humiliating is hard to know, but the symbolism of food offered in public, like intimacy under watchful eyes, is impossible to ignore. Remarkably, even the very order of dishes carried meaning. A decree from Naples outlines the proper sequence of warm and cold foods, echoing humoral medicine. Meat followed by fruit was said to balance the body, preventing corruption of humours. Yet for a princess, this wasn't only diet, it was often justification for offering certain dishes to certain men, framed as medicine, but understood as something else entirely. One mischievous anecdote from Aragon tells of a princess slipping sugared almonds into a knight's goblet during a feast. The gesture, seemingly playful, was interpreted as intimate beyond measure. Songs were composed, mocking and praising in equal measure, and the almond in wine became an emblem of her daring. In your senses, the hall is overwhelming. You hear the jangle of minstrels striking lutes between courses, the clang of knives on platters, the roar of laughter after ribald jokes. You smell honey dripping on roasted apples, pepper stinging your nose, butter sizzling on griddles. You feel grease on your fingers, the rough linen napkin failing to wipe it clean. Feasting is carnal, physical, and every act of eating becomes performance under dozens of watching eyes. Scholars quarrel over whether princesses used these feasting customs to exercise agency or whether they were trapped in roles scripted for them. Some insist that playing with fruit or pouring wine was a subtle way to flirt, reclaiming a shred of power. Others argue that every move was scrutinized and mocked, leaving women judged unfairly no matter what. The split in opinion mirrors the split in the very experience's moments of thrill, moments of humiliation. For a moment you lean back, dizzy with wine fumes and firelight. The hall blurs, voices rise, feet stamp rhythm into the floor. At the center of it all sits a princess, her every bite a performance, her every swallow turned into rumor. The feast is not nourishment but theater. And then, as the laughter softens, another sound emerges, the hush of a garden at night. The smell of grease and pepper fades, replaced by crushed mint and damp earth. The flicker of torches dissolves into moonlight on leaves. Now you are being drawn away from the hall into the shadows of palace gardens, where nocturnal rituals, half prayer, half secret rendezvous await. The clamor of the banquet drifts away, and you find yourself stepping into cool night air. The heavy scents of roast meat and pepper vanish, replaced by crushed mint, damp moss, and the faint sweetness of blooming jasmine. Moonlight slides across marble balustrades, and the only sound is the chirp of crickets blending with the faint splash of a garden fountain. These palace gardens, trimmed and ordered by day, became by night a stage for some of the strangest nocturnal rituals ever whispered about princesses. Contemporary inventories of estates confirm that most royal residences contained enclosed gardens, often inspired by cloister courtyards, but transformed into pleasure grounds with fountains, labyrinth paths, and perfumed shrubs. By day, they were sites of meditation or polite strolls, but by night, stories tell of rituals involving herbs, moonlight, and gestures that blurred devotion and desire. What's striking is how deliberately lunar cycles were tied to these practices. Chronicles from Provence mention princesses slipping into gardens on the full moon to pluck certain herbs believed to stir fertility. Sage, mint, and rue were carried back to chambers, dried under pillows or brewed into teas. To outsiders, it was harmless medicine. To those within the ritual, it was an invocation of both body and spirit. An unusual note appears in a Bavarian herbal. It preserves a recipe for a drink made of honey, poppy, and violet petals, to be consumed while barefoot in the grass under starlight. The manuscript does not name its patron, but marginal notes hint that noblewomen used it as charm against sterility. Imagine a princess padding across cold dew, gown hem damp, whispering Latin prayers as she sips the brew. Courtly tongues wagged about a Hungarian princess caught wandering barefoot through the palace orchard at midnight. Servants whispered she was gathering blossoms for spells. The official story recorded by her confessors insists she was only praying to the Virgin, yet the gossip never died, painting her as half saint, half sorceress, caught between piety and forbidden ritual. For a moment, it feels as though you are in that garden yourself. The gravel crunches underfoot, the cool air presses against your cheeks, and the scent of rosemary rises as you brush past. Your fingertips graze damp leaves, and the moonlight feels almost solid, silvering your skin. You pause by a fountain, listening to the trickle of water as though it answers your breath. The stillness is both sacred and illicit. A curious detail from Venetian records tells of nocturnal processions staged not by commoners but by noble daughters themselves. With candles cupped in their hands, they walked the paths singing verses that merged psalm tones with folk refrains. To the untrained ear, it was prayer. To insiders, certain refrains carried double meanings, alluding to fertility and secret love. The line between devotion and daring blurred, step by step. Remarkably, gardens often became sites of confessions far different from church. A Neapolitan princess supposedly used her herb plot as meeting place, her handmaid arranging benches of lavender and thyme for whispered conversations with a suitor. When the affair was discovered, the suitor was banished, but the garden gained a reputation as a dangerous place where plants remembered secrets. One ribald anecdote from Artois recounts a prank played on a princess who loved moonlit strolls. Courtiers once hid behind hedges and released a goat into the path, startling her. The laughter echoed for weeks, and though the tale was told as comedy, its cruel undertone reminds you how vulnerable these rituals made women watched, mocked, interrupted even in the dark. An unusual element emerges from Polish letters. Some princesses cultivated mandrake roots in their private gardens, the plant associated with both medicine and lust. Chroniclers describe roots carved into human shapes, wrapped in silk, and hidden in caskets. To modern ears it sounds absurd. To medieval minds, it was a potent symbol, dangerous enough to risk scandal if discovered. The sensory weight is overwhelming here. You hear the buzz of moth wings brushing torch flames, the splash of fish stirring in the pond. You smell damp stone, bitter rue, sweet jasmine, all mingling into a heady perfume. You feel the prick of thorns when your gown brushes a rose hedge, the cold dampness of marble as you lean against it. The garden is alive with texture, sound, and implication. Researchers remain divided on whether these nocturnal rituals were serious spiritual practices or exaggerated gossip. Some scholars argue they were sincere attempts at folk healing, blending Christian devotion with old herbal lore. Others suspect most were playful games, recast later as scandal. Still others think both are true rituals shifting meaning depending on who watched and who remembered. For a moment you close your eyes and imagine a princess kneeling in the grass, hands pressed to earth still warm from the day. She whispers, not loudly, but enough that the words carry toward the fountain. Is it prayer? Is it spell? Perhaps she herself does not know. What matters is that under moonlight, she feels both possibility and peril. And just as that silver glow seems to hold steady, the garden begins to fade. The perfume of herbs dissolves into the sharper tang of ink and parchment, the rustle of quills, the murmur of clerks. Now you find yourself transported into the world of official records where even marriage contracts, written in rigid Latin, carried curious clauses about consummation and desire. The hush of the moonlit garden slips away, and you find yourself inside a chamber heavy with parchment and candle smoke. The scent is sharp ink mixed with drying wax, parchment scraped clean and stretched tight. Quills scratch in rhythm like beetles crawling over wood. Here, intimacy does not unfold in shadows or whispers, but in the crisp lines of official marriage contracts. These documents, dry to our eyes, often hid the strangest clauses ever imposed on princesses. Royal ledgers prove without doubt that contracts governed more than dowries or property rights. They frequently contained clauses about consummation, fertility, and the physical obligations of the bride. To read them is to see how politics turned bodies into legal evidence. A princess did not merely marry her very ability to bear heirs was notarized, timed, and witnessed on paper. What's striking is how blunt some of the language became. A 13th century French contract specifies that consummation should occur within 3 days of the wedding, or the union could be annulled. In Castile, another record required that if no child was conceived within a year, negotiations for annulment could begin. Such clauses transformed intimacy into contractual duty, stripping away privacy with chilling precision. An unusual note appears in Neapolitan archives. A contract dictated that the bride should be examined by matrons if disputes arose over consummation. Whether this examination was symbolic or literal remains uncertain. Scholars still quarrel over how invasive such procedures were, but the very mention sends a shiver. Imagine your body treated as evidence, your honor weighed in margins of a legal text. Courtly tongues wagged about a Sicilian princess whose contract included an astonishing escape clause. If her husband proved impotent, she was permitted to return to her father's house with her dowry intact. The gossip this sparked was immense, for it implied mistrust of the groom even before vows were spoken. Some whispered that the bride's family knew something others did not. For a moment, it feels as though you are in that scriptorium yourself. The light is dim, candles sputtering, shadows shivering along vaulted stone. You feel the rough wood of the table under your palms, hear the rasp of quills, the shuffle of clerks adjusting robes. The parchment is cold under your fingers, ink still tacky, words binding lives more tightly than chains. Remarkably, contracts often borrowed imagery from theology. One Hungarian document insists that the bride and groom must become one flesh within a set number of nights, echoing biblical phrasing while turning it into legal demand. What should have been sacred metaphor hardened into obligation. A mischievous anecdote from Burgundy tells of a princess who signed her contract with an exaggerated flourish, drawing a heart above her name. The scribes tried to scrape it off, scandalized that she had inserted something so frivolous into a sacred record. But the mark remained faintly visible, a ghost of her defiance preserved for centuries. A curious clause appears in English records, stating that if the groom died before consummation, the princess was obliged to prove her virginity publicly in order to reclaim her dowry. The idea that a woman's financial security could hinge on such humiliating display reveals the absurd extremes of these documents. The sensory impressions here are suffocating. You hear the scratch of quill on skin parchment, the clink of seals pressed into hot wax, the hollow cough of clerks clearing their throats. You smell ink bitter as iron, smoke stinging your nose, parchment exuding faint musk of animal hide. Each sensation underscores the weight of words that outlived the people bound by them. Scholarly debate continues around how strictly these clauses were enforced. Some researchers believe they were rarely acted upon, serving more as threats than realities. Others argue that annulment cases, often preserved in papal records, show how ruthlessly such provisions could be wielded against women. The arguments split sharply, leaving modern readers unsettled by the possibility that both may be true. For a moment, you close your eyes and imagine a princess pressing her seal onto hot wax. The smell singes your nostrils, the wax cools quickly, and with it hardens a fate she cannot escape. Around her, men nod in satisfaction, while she alone knows the words mean obligations far beyond property. And just as the wax sets, the parchment crumbles into darkness. The scratch of quills dissolves into a low hum, the sound of prayers carried on night air. You are no longer in a scriptorium, but in a chamber lit by flickering candles, their smoke curling upward like incense. Soon, you will enter the world of spiritual confession, where the strangest desires were not only written but spoken aloud in trembling whispers. The scriptorium fades, its ink and parchment dissolving into the hush of a dimly lit chamber. You smell the faint sweetness of incense, hear the low murmur of prayers half muttered in Latin, and feel the cool press of stone beneath your knees. This is no hall of law or banquet, but a confessional space where words, not contracts, carried the most bizarre weight. Here, princesses whispered the private details of their hearts, often forced to surrender even their most intimate curiosities to the judgment of priests. Archival notes show that confession was compulsory for the highest born as well as the lowest, especially after the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 mandated annual confession for every Christian. A princess might enter this dark booth believing she sought absolution, but she often found herself interrogated. The priest asked questions not only of sins but of desires, probing for details that would never have been spoken aloud in any other setting. What's striking is the double edge of these encounters. On one hand, confession was meant to cleanse. On the other, it dragged into the open acts that otherwise might have faded as mere thoughts. Priests pressed. Had she entertained lustful dreams? Had she touched herself? Had she allowed wandering glances? And the princess, whether guilty or not, was compelled to answer. A curious record from Catalonia preserves a priest's notes on a noblewoman who confessed to imagining her husband as another man. Whether this was truth or invention, the scribe turned it into moral lesson, declaring that even imagination was betrayal. The princess's private thought became communal warning, carved into parchment, Courtly gossip swirled around a Bavarian princess, rumored to have confessed under pressure that she once danced too freely during Lent. The sin itself was trivial, but priests twisted it into accusation of temptation, suggesting her body lured others astray. For weeks, satirical verses circulated, mocking her as the saint of swaying hips. What began as whispered penitence bloomed into spectacle. For a moment, it feels as though you kneel there yourself. The confessional dark around you, the smell of incense heavy, the sound of your own breathing amplified. A low voice urges you to speak. Each word you utter clinks like a chain falling into place. The wooden grill scratches your cheek as you lean in, and you wonder if silence would be safer than truth. An unusual directive appears in Parisian penitential manuals. Priests were advised to ask noblewomen if they had engaged in unnatural gestures with other women. That such a question was codified reveals both awareness and suspicion of practices often left unspoken. Scholars remain divided on whether these questions reflected real behavior or merely clerical paranoia, but the presence of the text itself is startling. Remarkably, some princesses turned the moment of confession into subtle resistance. A Florentine story tells of one who, when pressed about thoughts of desire, replied, "Yes, I dreamed of honey dripping from figs, and perhaps that is sin enough." Her priest, flustered, gave light penance. The anecdote lingers, half comic, half tragic, a woman reducing an interrogation to metaphor, reclaiming a shred of control. One mischievous rumor insists that a Castilian princess deliberately exaggerated her confessions, inventing sins to shock her confessors and shorten the ordeal. Whether true or not, the tale suggests how unbearable constant scrutiny became, that even invention seemed preferable to silence under pressure. The sensory weight of the space presses in. You hear the low rumble of chanting monks nearby, the shuffle of knees on stone, the faint creak of wooden beams. You smell resin incense burning too hot, its smoke acrid and sweet at once. You feel the chill of stone seeping through your gown, your palms damp against the carved wood. The confessional is less shelter than cage. Scholars quarrel over whether confession truly liberated women by offering them a private outlet, or whether it intensified their vulnerability by trapping them in cycles of shame. Some argue that the priest's ear was the only safe place for forbidden words. Others insist that nothing confessed remained private, for clerics turned stories into sermons, and gossip slipped through cloister walls like smoke. No agreement has been reached, leaving the confessional both sanctuary and snare. For a moment, you close your eyes, and the priest's voice dissolves into a gentler hum. The incense smoke softens, the walls widen, and the chamber blurs into stillness. The story you have walked through banquets and cloisters, gardens and contracts begins to dissolve. You are left with candlelight dimming slowly, the crackle of wax softening, the air cooling as if urging you toward rest. Now the pace slows. The torches gutter out one by one, leaving only the faintest glow at the edge of vision. The echoes of laughter, music, and whispers fade into a quiet that feels softer than silence itself. The air is cool, like night drifting through a half-open window, carrying nothing more than the faint scent of wax and stone. You let your thoughts drift backward, tracing the strange journey of these princesses. You walked with them through ballrooms, where each step carried secret meanings, through cloisters where ink stains hid double lessons, through gardens where moonlight felt like forbidden touch, through halls where feasts turned food into coded language, and through scriptoriums where contracts bound desire tighter than any chain. Each scene was sharp, bright, sometimes absurd, but now they blur together into a single softened image. You notice the rhythm of your own breath. Inhale, and the last threads of candle smoke drift inward. Exhale, and the walls of stone dissolve into air. Your body feels heavier, sinking down, as though the very weight of history has grown drowsy and asks you to rest with it. The voices of scholars arguing fade away. The rustle of parchment quiets. The gardens close their petals. The banquet tables empty. The cloisters fall silent. Even the confessional, with its sharp wood and heavy incense, loses its edge, becoming only a gentle shadow in the background of your mind. And in that quiet, you realize the story is not about scandal or spectacle, but about human longing always hidden, always searching for a voice. It hums softly, a lullaby beneath centuries. Let that lullaby carry you now. Let your breath slow, your eyelids grow heavy, your thoughts unwind. The candles have burned low, the halls are empty, and the night is yours.